All right. All right, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the California Board of Occupational Therapy Board meeting on Thursday, December 8th, 2016. The time is 9:34 a.m., and our secretary, Sharon Pavlovich, is not here, and so Richard, if you could take roll, please.
Sure, do I have to bring a list? Sharon's out. Jeff Farrow? Present. Beata Marcos?
Present.
Richard Bookwalter, present. Denise Miller?
Present. Laura Hayes.
Laura Hayes?
Teresa Davey.
Davies?
Here, present.
All.
Perfect. We have a
I
quorum.
believe we have a quorum.
Thank you, Richard. Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you to everybody for being here. My name is Denise Miller, and I am your board president. And a few of the comments that I wanted to just share with you is that it is hard to believe that we are already in December of 2016. It has been quite a full year for this particular board. As you may know, according to the regulations, we are required to have 4 board meetings a year, but based on our strategic plan and our ad hoc committees and our orientation and our sunset review report, we have practically all moved in together. Luckily, it's a very productive and fun board, and equally so, we get a lot of work done, and we have a lot of great dialogue and debate with the charge that's before us to really look at the regulatory aspect of occupational therapy in California, keeping in mind that we are charged to protect the consumer. We couldn't do it without the board staff that we have with us. It's been quite a year. If it's been quite a year for us, it's been equally so quite a year for them. And so we have with us our executive director, Heather Martin. We have with us our counsel, Ileana Butu. We have Jeff Hansen, and we have Jody Quesada. And each of these people serve to really build us up, combined with so much of the staff that we have in the audience, which I'm really looking forward to our public members being able to meet. So I did want to start by just thanking the staff and telling you what we've been up to, wishing you a happy holidays, and letting you know that we are pretty excited about what 2017 holds for occupational therapy, the consumer, in the state of California. And with that, I'll turn it over to any of the other board members who'd like to make remarks. Starting first with our Vice President, Richard.
No, just welcome to all the visitors. Thank you for coming.
Anybody to my left? Laura, Teresa, do you have any comments? Jeff, Beata?
Don't have any comments.
No, I just concur. It's been a fun, busy year, but it's been fun. Thanks for coming.
Okay, and with that, if we could take just a moment and turn it over to our public and have each of you, it is optional, but if you are so willing, if you could please introduce yourself and your title, and that's pretty much it. So we'll start first with the front row, if you could just state your name and who you're with.
Yes, my name is Heather Kitching. I am a license holder as well as the standing president of Otech.
And I'm Chuck Wilmarth, Director of State Affairs and Health Policy with the American Occupational Therapy Association.
I'm Sean Conway. I'm with the National Board for Certification in Occupational Therapy.
Jennifer Snyder, Capital Advocacy. I work with the Occupational Therapy Association of California.
Lindsay Goldhardt of Capital Advocacy. Winifred Schultz-Krohn, I'm a license holder and I'm a professor and chair of the Occupational Therapy Department at San Jose State University.
Lynette Beatles, and I'm a licensed occupational therapist. I'm the academic field coordinator at Sacramento City College.
Ada Boone Hurl, license holder and occupational therapy assistant, Program Director and Professor, Sacramento City College OT Assistant Program.
Ray Garcia, Enforcement Unit, Office Technician with Board of Occupational Therapy.
I'm Roland McCullough, working with Administrative Unit and Occupational Therapy Board.
Norma Rhodey, Office Assistant for Board of Occupational Therapy.
I'm Joby Starr, Staff Service Analyst for Occupational Therapy Board.
Dimitri Montu, I'm the licensing technician for the Board of Occupational Therapy.
Well, thank you very much, and we are very pleased to have this meeting in Sacramento so that so much of our staff, I know that for those of you who come to meetings, you see the faces of our staff that is always with us, but down back here on this side of the room are the staff that help build us up, and so they're sort of the silent warriors that we couldn't do without, and we're very grateful for them as an entire board. With that being said, we're going to move on to agenda item 4, for public comment sessions not on the agenda. And at this time, do we have them come to the microphone, or just, if you have a public comment, if you could just come forward to the holding cell? Kidding. I mean, the table before us.
Good morning. My name is Ada Boone Hurl. I'm here to bring a request as not only a professor, an educator, but also as a practitioner regarding the potential for the board to review the requirements for continuing education for new licensees within their first renewal period. And on October 26th, I submitted a letter to the board regarding this request. It's been my experience as a program director in dealing with new graduates and having conversation with them, a rather laissez-faire attitude regarding continuing education among some of these new practitioners. Oh, I'll get it done, I've got time, and then it becomes a rush to complete that necessary continuing education. In support of my request and position, in that letter I had gone to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and identified the top 5 states employing occupational therapists and occupational therapy assistants, and looked at what their practices were to provide that as initial information for the board. And Florida, they are exempt only if licensed in the second biennium of that renewal, the first renewal period. Illinois, they're exempt. New York, they're required to have continuing education in that first renewal period. Ohio is exempt, Pennsylvania is exempt, but Texas requires it within that new period. That was preliminary information just to kind of get an idea if there was precedent for the discussion for consideration. Once again, in the light of consumer protection, the least experienced practitioners can go the longest without continuing education, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to express that opinion, and I thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for being here. Heather, can you bring the board up to date a little bit about the delivery of your letter came within one day of our last board meeting, so, yeah.
Yeah, so I was out of the office because I went down to speak at Santa Ana College that day. So the letter basically crossed. Ada and I spoke about it earlier this week, and if the board, chooses, which I would assume that this would come up because it came up in a previous board meeting, then the letter, copy of the letter will actually be provided at the March meeting.
So the request then is for us to put this on the agenda for March 2017.
Correct.
Put this discussion. Just curious, Ada, no pressure here, but our next meeting is in San Jose. Are you able to join us, or no? Okay. Okay. But the letter will be there. Okay. So we need someone to put forth that we put this on the March agenda? Or not?
I mean, do we need it in a motion form, or can we not just direct the executive director to put it?
What's your preference? They want a motion.
I'll make a motion to put it on the agenda for discussion in our next meeting.
And if we could take roll?
Richard Bookwalter, aye. Jeff Farrow,
Aye.
Laura Haith,
Aye.
Vanessa Devius,
Aye.
Denise Miller,
Yes?
Beata
Aye.
Marks.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for bringing that to our attention. Any other public comments? Okay, we are going to, believe it or not, for our next agenda item, we are going to take a short break so that we can have the presentation set up. So, for all intents and purposes, it is 9:45. We're going to take a break for all of 5 minutes so that we can set up for agenda item 5. Coming back together. It is 9:50. Oh, exactly 5 minutes. Couldn't have planned that better. 9:50, we're going to resume the California Board of Occupational Therapy meeting. We're starting with agenda item 5, and we'd like to welcome Chuck Wilmarth, Director of State Affairs, American Occupational Therapy Association.
Great. Well, appreciate the opportunity to address the board, and figured that I would provide some updates about some things that we're working on at AOTA to the board, and also be available to answer any questions the board might have. And just a little bit about AOTA for those that may not be familiar. We are the American Occupational Therapy Association. We're the National Professional Association. We were founded in 1917, and proud to say we are celebrating our 100th centennial anniversary this year. More about that in a minute. Our membership recently crossed 60,000, and that includes occupational therapists, occupational therapy assistants, and students. We represent all occupational therapy profession to policymakers, and we put that number around 213,000 practitioners and students in the United States. We put the workforce to be at about 180,000. So we educate the public and advance the profession by providing resources, setting standards, and advocating for the profession in healthcare. We're based in Bethesda, Maryland. So just a quick introduction about AOTA. Wanted to provide some updates about AOTA's annual conference, specifically related to a meeting that's coming up. I wanted to mention some recent AOTA documents, and then also provide some information to the board from ACOT related to accreditation, but also to provide some information about the pipeline of therapy assistants and therapists in terms of joining the profession. So first off, please join us for the AOTA conference. We're going to be in Philadelphia this year. Housing opened yesterday, and it's very competitive. I urge you to get onto the website if you're interested to book your housing. And the meeting will be held on March 30th through April 2nd. There is a website with all that detailed information. Specific to state regulators, we are having a licensure portability stakeholder meeting on Wednesday, March 29th. And that's actually the day before the conference actually begins. It's going to be, well, it's either going to be at the Marriott or it's going to be in the convention center. We're not sure. That they're not very far apart. From 2 o'clock until 5 p.m. on Wednesday. We're also having a forum for state regulators on Friday. Denise actually Chairperson Miller actually participated last year. We were appreciative of the content that was provided. In terms of the licensure portability meeting, we are going to be inviting state regulatory boards, including staff members, state association leaders, NBCOT representatives, employers, and others. And so we're pleased to have that meeting. And I just said this, but specifically, Coleman Eldridge, who's the director for the National Center for Interstate Compacts with the Council of State Governments, will participate. And so Coleman is the person at the center of CSG that works on compacts. So he's been at the center of the compact for physical therapy, for the physicians, and for others. And he's going to provide some information about what is a compact, how does it work, and also what is going on in the states in terms of licensure compacts. We've also invited a representative from the National Council of State Boards of Nursing to talk about the nurse licensure compact, both in terms of the original compact, the revised compact, and then there's a new compact for APRNs, the Advanced Practice Registered Nurses. So we're hopeful that he will be able to attend and talk about an experience in another profession. I should mention that there was an ad hoc committee at AOTA that looked at this issue. The report is available. I believe I've submitted it, can certainly share it again. That report goes into detail about what other professions are doing, including the physical therapists, the nurses, psychologists, state EMS officials, and others, and also contemplates, what does the ad hoc committee recommend for the profession of OT. They debated discussion about basically streamlined licensure process versus a compact or some other type of agreement, and came down on the side, that group gave its recommendations to AOTA's Representative Assembly did approve a motion suggesting that licensure portability, including a compact, should be the way to go for occupational therapy. The report also included a recommendation that the AOTA convene a stakeholder meeting. So that's what this meeting's about. From my perspective, this is to start the discussion about the possibility of portability for the OT profession. Many hurdles remain. You have to have a critical mass. There has to be enough money, enough people interested in a licensure compact or other type of agreement to make it work. If we create a licensure compact across 15 states and no one decides to pay extra money to get a license that is essentially portable, it's not going to work. So I think the first step really here is to convene the stakeholders and provide the basic factual information about what the possibilities are, what it would take, and see what kind of discussion evolves around the interest in this for OT. I think it's something that the profession should explore. If we don't go down this road, other professions will have a leg up on us. There are certainly drivers for this type of movement, including telehealth, so we'll have a discussion about that. But then there's also situations where both the therapist needs to travel to multiple states, and then we have clients that are on the move. So looking forward to that discussion and what that might look like. I want to shift gears and just mention a couple of official documents, two of which are included in your handouts today. One is an approved document related to continuing professional development, and the other is related to OT's role in medication management. Now, the continuing professional development document is finalized. It's on our website. You have a copy of it. And in essence, the CCPD, Continuing Competence Professional Development Commission of AOTA, put forward a document that creates a vision for what things should look like. And AOTA is going to be using this with stakeholders to suggest that the existing process for state continuing education requirements, state continuing competence requirements need to evolve. That in most states, you have to get a certain number of points in a certain type of categories in order to renew your license. We think that there should be a more thoughtful process put into place by state regulatory boards that is designed by the licensee, that they put together. They do an evaluation of their current and anticipated roles, their skills, their knowledge, their competencies, and that from that drives the courses, the different types of professional activities that they pursue in order to stay competent and develop professionally. So I think what's going to happen next is we're going to use this document to revise AOTA's Model Continuing Competence Guidelines. And those are a resource to state associations and state regulatory boards as they look at how to evolve their current requirements. I should mention that Colorado actually is one of the first states to evolve the requirements, that you have to do a self-assessment, you have to do a professional development plan, and that information is available to the agency that oversees licensure, and they're going through the first cycle, and it'll be interesting to see how that has worked out. But that's a situation where it isn't just, I need 24 contact hours over 2 years, and I document that and I'm done. It's some thought has to be put into it. So that's the document before you. The second is a draft document. Now, we did send this document out to state regulatory boards for comments. We do recognize that your timeline of meeting and responding may not mesh with our deadlines, but we wanted to get this document out to state regulatory boards to show that AOTA is in fact addressing this issue. And one of the drivers for that is that this issue has come up before state regulatory boards. Arkansas comes to mind, and most recently Oregon and Washington State. And in those two states, a provider sent questions to the regulatory board, and they were very specific. And those questions were related to the role of the occupational therapist in completing items on the OASIS, the home health documentation system for clients. And here are some questions that were posed to the regulatory boards in Oregon and Washington State. Does complying with federal regulations by completing the drug regimen review fall within the scope of PTOT or SLP? And so this was a question that was actually posed to 3 boards. Is the PTOT or SLP to add medications to a written or electronic list after confirming that this medication is missing? What about removing and updating such as dosage medications? Are therapists able to transcribe medications as written to patient-friendly language? So these are items that are on the OASIS that therapists that are in home health are addressing. And the issue that came before the board is this provider wanted the board to respond to say affirmatively, yes, these things are within the scope of OT. The problem is the scope of practice language in Oregon and Washington has nothing about this. Here's another one. If written material is provided for the PTOT or SLP regarding high-risk medications, opioids, insulin, and blood thinners, is that therapist able to provide information to a patient regarding signs and symptoms to watch for and when to contact their physician? You're just not going to find anything like that in the state scope of practice statement. So the draft document hopes to address some of those issues and provide links to the evidence to support the role of OTs in medication management. In addition to that document, we're going to be working on a continuing education course that's going to be available to practitioners to help them along the way. This is current practice. OTs that are working in home health are addressing medications, and we hope that this document will be helpful to them, but is also to regulatory boards in helping to articulate OT's role in this area. It also might be helpful for the state associations to consider as they revise their scope of practice laws to make sure that this is something that OTs can continue to do. I wanted to mention that there are 2 documents on the horizon that are going to be available for comment. Currently, there is a knowledge and skills paper related to mental health, and there's a knowledge and skills paper related to feeding, eating, and swallowing management. Both of those documents are up for review, and actually they're going to be converted into either statements or position papers. Basically, not as much detail in these documents. And these two are very important, mental health promotion, prevention, and intervention in occupational therapy practice, as well as OT's role in feeding, eating, and swallowing management. The second one is probably very important in the state of California, given the language in the licensure law that requires additional advanced practices in order to address swallowing. Okay, so just some updates from ACOTE. Essentially, this is a list of the various program statuses for doctoral, master's, and OTA, the total number of programs. You'll see that there are 155 master's programs. There's 14 at the doctoral level, and then 220 for OTA. And you can read this as it's in your handouts, but essentially the profession is growing. The number of programs, both at the OT and OTA levels, is expanding. And that is creating a lot of new therapists and therapy assistants. The ACOTE accreditation standards are periodically revised, and this is just some information about the Educational Standards Review Committee and what they are doing. And essentially, the draft 1 of the new OT and OTA accreditation standards is available. And there are, that does apply to the doctoral and master's level, and so those are existing. The associate's degree level accreditation standards already exist, and there are new standards that are being developed related to the baccalaureate OTA level. Basically, this is just some detail about how the feedback is going to be taken and integrated. I think the important thing is that the ACOT will be looking at the first draft and having a meeting, and that the draft standards will be available to members and to the public to review, and that there's going to be an open hearing regarding the standards at AOTA's annual conference. The group was going to have a conference call in March to look at the comments. I guess the takeaway here is that stakeholders, including the California Board of Occupational Therapy, the State Association, can certainly review the accreditation standards and provide comments through the process to ACOT. Scope of practice issues occasionally come up, and the questions many times turn to what's in the accreditation standards related to this particular topic. Modalities is one area, swallowing might be another, and so it's definitely, the standards definitely have an impact on scope of practice. Let's see, final review of the standards will be, review and approval will be in December 2017, and then the implementation will take place in mid-2019 or 2020, and then programs will have 18 months to implement the new standards. And so at that point, obviously the decisions will be made about what the standards are, and we'll see where that goes. The critical piece, I think, is as the standards are revised and there's input, the board and others should provide their comments to ACOT. I should also mention that ACOT is developing post-professional guidelines. There was a call for comments in October. This deadline has passed. These guidelines are just that. They are not required. They are guidelines. So with that, here's my contact information. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to mention. I think that is it for now. Be available to answer any questions anyone might have. Questions?
Chuck, I have a question. On the two documents you mentioned regarding the swallowing, and I can't remember the exact title, when do you expect those to be available and ready?
So so those two documents are about to go for a call for comments, and then there will be a period of time. I mean, I think it's definitely going to be after the new year because those things are underway. It'll be in the spring. And right now, both documents are being tweaked. If there's any particular comments that folks have that could be conveyed to me to send back. One of the things that is of concern to policy people like myself is that the knowledge and skills papers are going away, and that these are position statements. So the guidance that was previously included in the knowledge and skills paper related to feeding, eating, and swallowing is a bit thinner than in the new document. And so we have some scope of practice challenges from our colleagues in speech-language pathology, and those documents do provide support for OT's role in some of the advanced instrumentation techniques. And so that's one of the things we're taking a close look at is how do the new documents convey support for those areas? Sure.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Chuck, I was interested in the continuing professional development plan that you showed us some material on, and it looks a little bit sort of reminiscent of NBCOT's professional development materials as well. Are those two processes aligned in any way, or?
I think we might get into that more tomorrow. Our document, and I believe NBCOT also, both of us looked at some reports from the Institute of Medicine. There was an Institute of Medicine report on continuing the continuing education system and evolving it to this new process around continuing professional development. There was also another report that the name is escaping me right now, but also suggested that the scope of the education that healthcare professionals should be getting should be broader, that we should be looking at interprofessional team-based care, that we should be looking at health informatics, that we should be looking at quality improvement. And so, part of it is the process by which someone thinks about what they need, but also looking at sort of the broader system and how it's changing and the competencies that are necessary. So I think that as we develop our model regulations, we will help articulate what that might look like. We have had an issue in some states where state boards are looking at continuing education activities, and is it directly related to OT or not? And if it's not directly related to OT, then it gets kicked out. Well, I would suggest that boards should take a broader view of the education that could be taken. That if we want to get into population-based healthcare, then we should be able to take CE in that area. If we want to get into operating in interprofessional teams, then a course that isn't directly related to occupational therapy clinical practice, but one based on operating in teams should count. So it's a different framework than currently exists.
Thanks.
Chuck, I also thank you for those comments. I do have a question for you, a second question on medication management, but I noticed specific on this continuing professional development that we do have the chairperson of the ad hoc in our audience. Is that correct? And I'm wondering if I could ask her to come forward. What I'm looking for, Winifred, is I'm looking for specifically, it would just be interesting to hear a little bit of the background from the practitioner standpoint and some of the discussion that came up during your committee meeting about the intent and the purpose for this particular. So would that be okay, Chuck?
Yeah, sure.
So if you could come on up.
Those mics probably work. Yeah, I think you could probably sit there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And to give a little background of the impetus for this paper, the initial work was being done to look at not just the number of units that need to be obtained prior to renewal of licensure or the phase of licensure, but the idea was really if we want to have a trajectory for professional development, both for whatever level of the OT practitioner, there needs to be an element of reflection. There needs to be an element of taking into consideration not only the current skill set, but the future skill set to meet not only the needs of the client, the need of the population, and a projection. So it is more than just an immediacy, but we were looking at the continuing professional development position paper as really an instrument by which a practitioner would project their future. And I mean, nobody has a crystal ball. But you can look at some things and really take into account that as an OT practitioner, we need to be aware of not only the immediacy of the needs, but be leading the profession into the future. So in doing that, that's why the position paper is not just saying, go to so many classes, make sure you check the boxes, make sure you check the list, make sure you have a number of units that you can submit to the board, but to truly have a trajectory by which you're looking for the future. Now, understand that part of the Commission on Continuing Competence and Professional Development, one of the boards reporting to it is the Board of Specialty and Advanced Certification. So when you're talking about board and specialty certification, they directly report to the Commission. So part of it was also thinking about, it isn't that everybody has to go that route, but as a profession, we really felt that practitioners are looking for how they can say, I want to have a say in what my future is looking at. I want to look at a mechanism by which I'm not just checking off a number of PDUs or a number of continuing competency units. I want to really be thinking professionally or as an OT practitioner how I can advance myself that will serve the profession and ultimately serve the consumers and the clients that we are providing OT service. Mm-hmm. So that was more of it, that reflection that is included, reflecting on what do I need to do, what do I have right now in my skill set, what do I want to develop, and not just so that I can meet licensure requirements and the immediacy of my client's needs, but what about the future, looking past that.
I wonder, I'm thinking out loud here, so if either of you can help me on this. So, for example, I do work in an area that's very population health focused, and I do also work in a hospital system, but my program is community-based, so it's on the new wave of where a lot of things are going in this aging population arena. So, for example, for me as a a professional OT, what I'm understanding is there may be certain courses that I take in my professional development that are not the traditional ones we've currently seen, and that I want to be able to receive credits for that. So I wonder, now flipping back to the regulatory hat, when I read this, I thought, I wonder if there's also an element of workforce development in this paper. If your committee, for example, if we don't help develop our workforce and other professions allow these types of things, does the consumer therefore suffer because we're not practicing in that area? Is that a reach, Chuck?
Well, okay, so I think we can improve in this area. I mean, certainly we need to look at our continuing professional development requirements, but also I think that at the entry level, that we also have to train differently. I mean, we're being trained in silos, and, well, we need to evolve how we're being trained. That if we're talking about interprofessional team-based care, well, at the entry level, there has to be some change there. And actually, there are some OT programs that are currently changing field work. They're having a team-based approach, and I think we need to look at that. Now, connecting those two together, I'm not sure what it would take, but it seems like we have to get there. And it's interesting, in the pharmacy world, the entity that oversees continuing professional development is also the one that accredits the entry-level program. So they have a nice linkage there between overall what is being conveyed in terms of professional development, both at entry level and ongoing practice. So I think challenges remain.
And I would agree that challenges do remain, but I think this gives a framework by which we can start to look at those emerging practice areas and to really look at those areas where occupational therapy may have been in the past and is no longer because of just raw numbers, or areas where we should be and we have not progressed into that area. And so when we sent this out for comment, when we sent it out for OT practitioners to give us feedback, overwhelmingly the responses that we received were very positive. Matter of fact, they were all very positive. There was just some, nitpicking about, you shouldn't do this, you should, it was more, somebody really had a degree in English, which we benefited from that when we did our edits. But the net effect was that it was a very positive response. And in addition, talking about that, it gave structure and it gave credence to the fact that they do want to progress the profession into areas that may not be siloed, as Chuck put it. So that can be that was part of the impetus behind writing this paper, and part of the urge to get it out.
Thank you. And if I may, I can't see, can I continue with questions? Is anybody else wanting to jump in, Teresa? Okay, if I may, I have one more question. So again, trying to really understand and integrate this, because I read this with great intrigue and trying to, in terms of understanding and from a practitioner standpoint. Now, I wonder, just in terms of being mindful and our collaborations together, knowing that, the state and the national associations really drive the practice issues of our profession, which this is one of those. We, as a board, from the regulatory standpoint, are looking how to regulate our profession, how to put forward the consumer front and center. And so can you draw some connection there for me?
Okay, well, so
What I'm really looking for is, what would you like this board to take away from this? How can we do our part so that as the profession's really moving forward on practice issues, we equally so are moving forward on how to regulate and be
well,
on top
I
of
think
this?
that the regulatory boards ultimately can be a driver here, that licensees look at the state requirements and, what do I have to do to renew my license? And I think a lot of folks are looking at the bare minimum, what's the minimum number of points I need, in which categories, how do I do that at the lowest cost? And that's fine. I mean, I understand that perspective. And I think that, the board is setting the minimum standards to renew your license. And if those standards are elevated and incorporate some of these concepts, that ultimately I think that consumers will benefit from having folks that are up to speed, but also that have taken courses in other areas that help them improve quality or work in interprofessional teams or use informatics to improve their practices. If they keep going to the same handwriting courses, we're not going to advance. So I would look to the regulations in Colorado. I think they broke some ground. And Colorado's interesting because for years, Colorado would not require CE requirements for licensure renewal, and there's a renaissance in the agency. And they decided that we are going to do this, but it's not just going to be about a certain number of points. There has to be a thoughtful process. So if the board, and this may this may require a change in statute. You may need more authority. If the board were to require some sort of thoughtful process of self-evaluation and the development of a professional development plan, I think that could advance things. And so I think that's the takeaway is, what are the minimum requirements to renew one's license? How can those be elevated? How can we hold our licensees accountable to using a thoughtful process? And I know it's a challenge. I mean, at the last board meeting, there was a discussion about folks that they don't renew their license and then they don't respond to, requests to pay attention. And so how do we come up with something that is reasonable but at the same time raises the bar? I encourage the board to review the IOM's report related to redesigning continuing education. And they raised some important points about how the current system is broke and needs to evolve.
Thank you.
Mind if I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, or make a statement? I appreciate this as a public member. I don't look at it quite maybe the way that all of the OTs and OTAs and people that are really associated with the profession do. I do know that a few of the topics that you raised have been in ad hoc committees that we've addressed and tried to explain that we felt that a lot of those were covered by the current scope of practice. However, the occupation seemed to want much clearer delineation of what that scope of practice is. So it's fine for us to hear about where you think that this can go, but from our perspective, going much to what Denise talked about, is our challenge is actually the legislature and a narrowing or tightening of the language to kind of support what you guys are proposing or encouraging education to be built around that we may not, that we may support, but we may have some particular concerns about if we go to take such a narrow perspective of that, that we could end up challenges. So one of the things I'd like you to do, other than talk about just OT and how this can improve OT, what would be helpful is, from your perspective, is looking at not just the stakeholders that would benefit by this, those stakeholders that may challenge this, those stakeholders that may in opposition that we may have to face if we were to support what you are basically looking to move for this occupation, should we have to go to the legislature and defend this kind of interpretation or better, for lack of a better term, more specificity in mental health, more specificity in swallowing, more specificity in medication recommendation, interactions, and all that kind of stuff. So we can be prepared if in case that does come forward, we can best defend the profession. Because it's great to sit there and just know this side of it, but you're dealing in multiple states, dealing with multiple occupations that have an overlap. We have a healthcare system that is encouraging to find whatever occupation provides equal protection at the lowest cost with the lowest redundancies. And so we've got to be prepared for those things. And so I appreciate the presentation and where you're going, but really to make it a full presentation and something that I think boards like us and us would enjoy is some idea of who our opposition would be, what their arguments are, how valid those arguments are, and what potential strength they're positioned at. Because let's face it, some of the occupations that we may come against on some of these may have even more members practicing, even stronger lobbies supporting. So we've got to be cognizant of all those things. So that would be my only recommendation going back to you as you develop this, is really do what I would call opposition research and really start to dig deep on how you can build an argument for your members and for the occupation that says this is the best path forward for the consumer and for the state and for ultimately those that are going to be expected to pay these changes that might go to OT now that may have been slipping somewhere else. Does that make sense?
All very good points. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Another comment that I wanted to make, moving right into the paper on medication management, if I may, just in terms of stating out loud for the public, and also in terms of feedback. I found this both as a practitioner, someone in practice, as well as someone who has to defend the practice from a regulatory standpoint. I found this sort of paper to be quite helpful. And I would encourage that as we go forward as a profession, clear and simple, occupational therapy's role in medication management. I can now defend this. I can take this paper, I can now defend this, especially the population I work with, combined with the evidence that is necessary to show our particular role and ability, and I can also know that I'm able to defend keeping the consumer safe. So I encourage AOTA and/or their work with our state association to continue to provide evidence in this clear manner, at least from someone who is sitting on the other side looking for ways to say what is our role, our scope in future items like mental health, like swallowing, where we know we have practitioners. And we also know from this board we have to, similar to the comments that Mr. Farrell made, that we have to, our task is clear about keeping the consumer safe. I would encourage you to just know that this is the future of how I think in these very fast times and times of really implementing action, this is how I think we can work together very well as both a profession and a regulatory board to show due worth and to really, your job again is to move the profession forward from a practice standpoint. Our job is to move it forward from a regulatory, but this level of evidence was very helpful. So
Great.
I hope future papers look like this. Any other comments?
Yeah, I wanted to just echo that statement. As a public board member, this document was very helpful and very insightful. And so the reason I asked for the expectation of when we could expect the next two documents from that sort of fashion was just based on the evidence there. So thank you for providing that.
Sure, and I'm happy to find out some more specifics about when those will be available and approved and finalized. I guess I just have one last comment. If there is an issue that comes up that is of interest to the board where a paper is needed, send it in. And it's something that AOTA is always looking for, where do we need a document? And many times it comes up as a scope question, and what is the role of OT in wound care management? What is the role of OT in physical aging modalities? And so if this board identifies a particular challenge, that's what we're here for.
Can I ask one more question? This reminds me of the working groups in nursing and in pharmacy to address literacy and how pill bottles are organized and how the information is conveyed and instructions on pill bottles. And it's a huge topic in medicine now. Medication errors is a big topic, and I'm sure there are working. I don't know of the names of any working groups doing this, but I would imagine that would be a good in for the organization to sort of become involved and to sort of assert a role in this by becoming involved in that. And I just wonder if you're familiar with any efforts or working groups.
I am not, but I think with a question like that, we'd go back to our experts that we worked with, those that developed the paper, and ask them, what circles are they running in, and actually that may give us an idea. Once we have the paper finalized, maybe we approach some of these groups and try to get involved in their efforts. So, a good point. I'm not sure about the answer, but definitely something I'll look into.
Actually, thank you, Vice President Bookwater. That actually prompted one more question that I do have about medication management. Aside from the value in this paper, I did prompt one question regarding our curriculum. I do know, because I have a fieldwork program with public health nurses. I do know that it's very clear in their curriculum that they take a pharmacology class. And I'm wondering, as we have papers about our role in medication management, if there's a filtering back through our fieldwork program where there are recommendations that will come down, as we continue to refine and develop these paper about what our role in, how does the National Association see themselves communicating that back, or do you, with the program fieldwork area, to have this in the curriculum so that indeed the education is matching what we say OTs can do? And again, that's driven by.
I might have to defer on that question.
And I think, and I'm putting on a hat as a program director, program chair. With the ACOT revisions, with the accreditation of occupational therapy education programs, in looking at ACOT does review papers, and they do review what has been put out by the profession. So ACOT would be, with the new standards coming out, and their deliberation, looking at what needs to be included in the profession, what needs in that pre-professional development and the pre-professional educational in the programs, whether at the OT or OTA level. So those revisions in ACOT will be determining what's going to be included in the curriculum. Those standards need to be met, and there needs to be a report submitted on a regular basis that those standards are not only in the curriculum but are being met, measured, and you have identified outcomes. So at this point, there is not one that specifically addresses medication management. It is more of a general ACOT accreditation standard, but what ACOT often does is look at the most current papers that have come out. So with the revisions that are proposed, and it's not final yet, it's just in draft 1, but as Chuck was mentioning, ACOT is looking at what do we need to do from a preparation perspective. So that, I think that's, sorry, I know it sounds like coming attractions at the movie theater, but
No,
kinda where
but
we're
just knowing and being mindful of each of our respective roles as we, as the profession is going forward and as we're into the 100th year, let's just say there's this paper on medication management, and let's just say a disciplinary case comes before us. OTs do believe they have a role in this. It's not yet in certain language within each of our scope specifically, and the universities haven't taken it on yet in terms of the curriculum. It would then therefore be very hard from a regulatory standpoint to defend an OT's role in that, would a case come before us. So I say that to encourage that we all are very mindful of what's before us and where we're going, and that we try to line up everything together in a
And
similar
I think an example can be seen with what happened with feeding, eating, and swallowing. So prior to having that clearly articulated in the ACOT standards that came out and the reinterpretation of or revisions that were 2011, in the 2011 revisions, the feeding, eating, and swallowing was called out as a very specific skill that must be included in the standards. It must be included in the education preparation for an OTA and an OT. And there were specific things that needed to be included. So with the ACOT standards, you can see that what they're doing is making sure that the preparation is there. And so in looking at that, although the position paper on feeding, eating, and swallowing has a long history, and there's been revisions and many iterations that have come out, ACOT specifically called that out as something that must be in the curriculum, measured and identified. So when they come and look at that, you have that as one of the standards you are clearly addressing within the preparation for an occupational therapy practitioner. And I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm assuming that with the ACOT revisions, they will be looking at the position papers that have just come out.
Great. Any other comments? Any comments from the public? Okay, well, we very much appreciate that presentation. Thanks for coming up. Moving Moving on to agenda item number 6, discussion and consideration of availability of fieldwork sites, potential workforce shortage, and impact to applicants and consumers.
Included in the meeting materials is a letter sent from Genesis Rehab to programs that are placing students within their facilities. And one of the reasons for bringing this forward is there is the requirement that starting in the next academic school year, that the schools and colleges would need to pay for the placement of those students. So you have the letter from Genesis Rehab Services. Several California program folks have weighed in. There was an email handed out this morning. It includes some fieldwork coordinators and some program directors on here, so that you can see that the schools are concerned about this. And actually, there are several representatives from the schools today who might be willing to share their perspective and the concerns they have resulting from this new requirement from Genesis Rehab.
Do we have any comments in the materials before us from the board?
I would say that this is the first company that's doing this, and there probably will be a lot of people that will follow, a lot of companies that will follow this. I just see it coming. The industry is pretty much going through lots of changes, and I just see this, I see this as, my company, Aegis Therapies, has not implemented anything like this yet, but it's like going to be dominoes, I believe.
I would just like to speak to the narrow issue of that would be before this board about PDUs being there's a suggestion in the email chain in the meeting materials that therapists who receive pay for supervising students might be made ineligible to receive PDUs for that supervising experience. And I just thought that was probably the only action item for this board, if to consider. I didn't really. I feel like that's a bit of that's kind of a leap to take at this, but it was an interesting idea. But I'm not really. We need to kind of see how this develops, and it would be a future agenda item, anyway. I think. I think it'd be pretty tricky to do that.
Just curious if we can hear from some of our public. It would have helped, in this day and age, everybody's in business is looking at different business models. So, I can't on the one hand critique Genesis for looking at that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, people have to go for it. What would have been more helpful, just in terms of understanding this, is, does anyone know, do they have the majority of fieldwork sites around the United States? Are they significant? Does anyone?
Do you mean Genesis?
Genesis, yeah.
Have the majority? I don't think they have the majority. I think that, for example, Aegis Therapies, who I work for, we have zillions of internships and things like that we're doing. And my concern is going to get passed on to the students.
Okay.
That's my concern.
Mm-hmm. So they don't have the majority, so what? I mean,
Well-
somebody tell me what I'm trying to understand.
I'll say that I think the significance is this is the first of the dominoes That's the significance, not that they are that powerful in and of themselves. It's just that it's an indication of the times and on what might be coming for everybody's trying to survive. Companies are trying to survive with the new, it's a new day. And so everybody's trying to figure out how can we do business and still be ethical and do all the things we want to do to benefit the patients and still survive. And this is a step that Genesis is taking, excuse me, and many other companies may just follow suit.
Do we have public comments? You want to come up to the microphone if you could?
Good morning again. My name is Winifred Schultz-Krohn, and now I'm wearing my hat as a program director at San Jose State University. And to give you a little background of San Jose State University as one of the two only public institutions in the entire state of California, one of the things that we have had to institute on our campus is actually food banks for our students because of food insecurity. Having an additional cost of $1,000, and we currently have well over 20 sites that we are not going to be able to use for field work because they're controlled by Genesis. Although we do not have a huge program, we admit 72 to 74 students per year. That does eliminate those sites, and it makes it more competitive for the other sites. As a public institution, we are not allowed to pass on that cost, and as a department, we do not have the funds to pay the additional $1,000. Students who are enrolled in public institutions are supported by the populace of California. That is the mission of the state institution, to provide the workforce for this state. And yet we are being restricted on the fieldwork sites that are available. We cannot pass that fee along to our students. Many of them are in debt to an extent that it's very limiting. And we're a public institution, not a private. In addition, ACODE is now requiring all program directors to submit data regarding the amount of debt students incur while they're enrolled in the program and what their availability of reaching or of being employed as an occupational therapy practitioner 6 months after graduation. And that's graduation completion of the fieldwork situation. I speak in a very compassionate way for my students. I do agree that it is probably, this is the tip of the iceberg. And if this continues to progress, how is it going to impact the consumers? Right now, we have a huge number of unfilled positions. We know that occupational therapists are the best individuals, the best profession to fill those positions. They are going unfilled because basically we do not have enough students. What restrains us, what constrains us from having enough students that we can put through the program, the fieldwork sites on the end. They're highly competitive and many places are restricting. This will not be an avenue to allow more students, at least from a public institution perspective, to have more fieldwork opportunities. It will actually curtail and constrain that. So if you think about the consumer, not the consumer who's receiving the services, but the larger consumer of the state of California, they will not be able to have the populace served by occupational therapists because we will be further constrained on the number of applicants we can accept because those sites will not be available for us.
You mind if I say something? Look, this brings to, I work in this in my regular life, right? There's this entire challenge of the cost of education. Who's going to supervise them once they get into the workplace? Years ago, I'm not going to give the whole history of it, almost every occupation within our country had some type of an apprenticeship program, right? You earned as you learned. Your earning was based upon what part of the knowledge you've learned going forward. There was this connection between the labor portion of it and the employer to make sure they got the best outcomes, they had the best trained workers. Unfortunately, the for-profit world has kind of changed a lot of that, right? That's been one of my biggest concerns about continually ratcheting up, whether they had an a master's at the end of their title or a doctorate at the end of their title. What the new, the super doctorate, which will be the next one once they've filled the maximum people in, is my biggest concern. And I think that's shared, I know within our state, our governor is very into trying to figure out alternative ways to educate. So that way education isn't just a knowledge base, but it becomes a skilled-based education. And so I'm working with that a lot. My fear is somebody, maybe not fear. My vision of what Genesis may have done and will start to do as other people follow will push us back to this working together to develop an apprenticeship. So you are an apprentice one, occupational therapist assistant, and then you're 2 and a 3, and they can earn money at the very beginning of the first module of the type of instruction they get to the point where they become a master OT. There can be collaboration between universities, public education, community colleges, fantastic way to do that. But if you see this becoming all about, and I know there's a lot of educators in here, and I don't want to offend any of you, but this is the fear of this type of stuff, is that people see a way to make money. And that money is on the backs of those that are trying to get into an industry that you're tracking how many actually get out of school and actually get a job. There's too many people who spend a lot of money and are in huge debt that can never even get a job in their occupation. So I, as a board member, would welcome any kind of, looking into where we can maybe go that path as an alternative, as some type of a, occupational earn-as-you-learn apprenticeship in this. And I mean, I'm speaking out of turn because I haven't talked to anybody else on my board, but that's, when this comes up, it really kind of burns me because there's so many good people that could do great things for people that can help our consumers that will be turned away by these additional costs. And there'll be, educators that won't get in because the people they need to do the oversight won't do it. And we can make a requirement in the state. We can make a requirement that if you want to operate in this space, you have to have apprentices. They can't charge us, they have to have them. So how do you charge somebody for something they have to have and be doing to help the growth for the greater good? So.
Well, which brings up the question for me of the sites that have stopped taking, so they've reduced the number of students they're willing to take for productivity reasons since the Medicare rules had changed and eliminated reimbursement for student services that they used to be able to do in past years. This is at least a company that has acknowledged here are the costs and we're willing to take them as long as we recoup some of those costs, whereas other facilities may simply say instead of taking 7 interns a year, we're only going to take 2 now, which is what's currently happening. That's the current state, as I understand it. I'd kind of like to see how it plays out. Unfortunately, I do think it's going to be additional costs, and there's the opportunity cost of being out of the job market and then having to pay a fee on top of it to get your internship. That is a barrier to entry to a workforce, and we need to have fewer barriers. We don't need to not to take down the barriers, not add to them.
Okay, my turn?
Yes.
So Lynette Beatles, and I'm employed full-time by Sacramento City College as their academic fieldwork coordinator. I'm also a member of the California Academic Fieldwork Coordinators Informal Association, and so I'm representing them today. A little bit, again, of history of what's been going on in the past, and I believe you guys are still working on it. We've come to you saying we're having difficulty finding fieldwork sites for the students that we need to place in order for them to become eligible to take the license and practice in the state of California or any place in the United States. So we've come to you in the past thinking that, well, if we increase the number of PDUs, and what we asked is that if the PDUs that the licensing board here is offering be similar to the PDUs that MBCOT offers, to increase the number of PDUs, hoping that practitioners would step up and say, yes, this is a good way for me to get PDUs. I learn and grow when I have students, because anyone that's in education and anyone that's taken students regularly knows you do a lot of learning and growth with students. So this has been an ongoing issue. I've been associated with fieldwork placement on and off through Sacramento City College since 1991. And definitely it's not the same world as it was in 1991 for anything that we do. Some of the concerns that we're talking about as educators working on finding academic sites is, as Richard has identified, we've had a decrease in sites because of changes in productivity, in changes in expectations of what people can do and not do with having students there. In being able to bill for treatments that students do when they're on the last portion of their fieldwork. So limitations in having the fieldwork sites out there is a major concern. We're required by accreditation to provide students with a variety of fieldwork sites. And when we start having, again, we're a community college, but even the private colleges, and I know we have more people here willing to speak, when we're looking at a fee and that fee having to be paid for some way in addition to what students are already paying for their education, it's limiting choices. It's limiting choices of where they can go. We will, have to be concerned of if this is the wave of the future, and there are other professions that have this, if this is the wave of the future, will students now start choosing their sites because, well, I don't want to go to this site because I have to pay a fee, so I want to go to this site, so I don't have to pay a fee. If it's fee-based by where they go and the students are requested to reimburse for that cost. We already have limitations in providing that diversity of sites informally with many practice areas saying, well, I don't want to take a student unless they say they want to work in this practice area. So be it pediatrics or hand therapy or, community-based, we have fieldwork sites saying to us, well, we only want to take your students that are really interested in working in this site when they're all done. That, again, makes it difficult for us to meet the accreditation requirements. It makes us difficult to provide well-rounded students, graduates, which we're required to do because we don't have people work in specialty areas. They can cross line and they can do that. So there's numerous challenges out there that this is just going to add another layer to that challenge. And I agree, it's a business proposition. We're looking at how businesses are going to go forward. From the national, the AOTA Fieldwork Educators meeting that was held in San Diego, it does not appear that there are other agencies doing this at this point in time. That was brought up there. Again, we have the New England Council for Academic Fieldwork Coordinators out there posting on their website that they, will not allow their students at this time to go to sites that require reimbursement. Unfortunately, I don't know that that's the best way to do things. It's a nice statement. I support the statement, but I believe if this is going to continue, once it gets started, and this starts next in 2017, yeah, it's coming up. Yep, that more sites are just going to do it, so we can't shoot ourselves in the foot by saying, no, we can't, We, as programs, San Jose, Sacramento City College, as a community college, we will be limited. Mm-hmm. But the private universities and that kind of stuff, have other options.
I'm wondering if student loan debt is a big problem in this country, but I am wondering, since, OT salaries have improved quite better than many salaries in recent years, and if some kind of loan program or deal with Genesis could be negotiated whereby the student could pay them back after working rather than upfront during the fieldwork training, just so that you could preserve the slots without having to face the other issue, which is contraction of the slots. Yeah, but yeah.
The other issue with students paying for their slots is you get into this feeling of I am owed. Well, I paid for this slot, so therefore you should pass me.
Yes,
Right.
that will very much be
Right.
that.
Yeah, so how can you not pass me? I just paid you, OT assistants $500, OT students $1,000.
Not unlike your courses where
Yes,
they
Yeah.
paid for your course and they want.
yeah.
But there is, with a course, there is a clear set of criteria by which the expectation is that you must meet this criteria. And although the we do have the fieldwork performance evaluation form that is completed. For a student to have to pay $1,000 as an OT, as an OTR, or $500 as an OTA, and then not to be able to progress, I think there could be a number of lawsuits. Because there's other sites that are not requiring this payment.
What about the issue of that Genesis brings up in its letter? We do not always have the need to recruit and hire new graduates in the geographies they're looking to be employed. We have also witnessed the proliferation of new therapy schools in geographies that already have established programs. I'm just wondering, could something be done on the level of accreditation to spread
Again,
programs out?
I'm going back to history, and I was on the roster of accreditators for ACOT back in 93, 95, and even back then, this was a big concern, especially at that time on the East Coast, because of the number of schools that kept opening up in similar areas. And unless things have changed, they're not allowed to regulate where programs are opening up. They can't say, I would love to see a school up in Chico.
Chico was the last site in California that I knew of that actually paid their interns, right? I don't know if they probably don't do that
No,
anymore.
they don't.
But they did.
There still are a few sites that pay their interns.
Yeah.
I will tell you that right now.
One of the things that I found interesting, I think it was our public member, Mr. Farrow, who brought it up, just because when I look at what they're proposing, and again, when I started earlier saying I understand it from a business model, from this perspective, I really see it as a workforce issue that could really affect our state in a great way, which therefore impacts the consumer in an even greater way. So, interestingly, I would like this board just to explore, or even to really understand if we have the authority. I think you made the statement about charging those facilities who are in business in California. What would that look like? Is that right? Can you say more about that?
Well, what I was going to say is there are conditions within the state of California and some of the existing apprenticeship classes that if you want to operate as a licensee in the state of California, most of them operate as a business, right? It isn't an individual licensee, so I don't know, again, as a public member, what the breakdown of OTs as individual independent contractors are versus OTs being part of a healthcare system in which, they have a bunch of them working for them and they're all operating independent with their license plus the association or whatever would be having their license. That the state could potentially, we would probably have to do some legislative work, definitely have to do some legislative work where we require a percentage of all employees to be an apprentice or a intern, so that way, as part of being able to hold the license to be able to bill and operate within the state, you have to do public good, which is you make sure that you begin to develop the people for the future as well. So they can't flip it on us to say, as we have these requirements, we will then bill you. We say, that's fine, you can bill us, but however, we're going to make it a requirement. So you can only try to bill us after you've exceeded the required amount, or whatever. There's a potential, I think, to do that. I think it's a lot of work, but, since this is the first, we should not anticipate it being the last, and we should start to prepare, sort of like I said to the gentleman out there that did the last presentation. We need to look at our opposition research and see what we can do to maximize participation in this industry and this occupation. And that's what I would recommend.
Ileana, did you want to weigh in at all on any of this topic?
Sure. Jeff is right. There would be some legislation that would need to happen in order to do this because the board doesn't have the authority to make that change at this time, through regulation. But it's definitely worth looking into, and I can do a little bit more legal research on my end to find out what this might look like. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
I have a question. I'm reading through this letter from Genesis. Has there been any discussion from any of the associations directly with Genesis on how this impacts specifically to the state? The letter is more blanket. It seems like a blanket decision nationally, which may or may not take into consideration areas like Chico and others that have a greater need. So has there been any discussion directly with Genesis on the reasons behind it, I'm looking from an association standpoint, if anyone's been in discussion at all.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. No, the answer is no. It's largely been addressed through the Fieldwork Council that Lynette referred to earlier, of which I am also a member, just to be clear on that. And I'm also an academic fieldwork coordinator at California State University, Dominguez Hills. So from my Otech president position, I can tell you, no, we haven't taken action on it because, for various reasons, because it was a nationally driven letter, honestly. But I do, now that I'm sitting here, if I can also just make a few comments from my academic fieldwork position. I don't have the need to reiterate what both Lynette and Wynn offered. I do want to say that Cal State Dominguez Hills is a sister program of San Jose State University. We're both in the CSU system. We also admit a cohort of 70 per year, with students having ranging a variety of needs, financially and otherwise, and everything Wynn stated will also apply to our student body at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And so I just wanted to add that in to be clear that everything she explained as a concern for students in her system would be double the number and scope and breadth, because we're going through the same thing in our own public program. And I agree with Board Member Haith's concerns that this probably is a domino effect in the future. So I agree with many of the comments already made, and I just kind of wanted to go on record with that as an additional voice, because I think there are many voices that would feel the same. But from the state association perspective, we would be happy to entertain this conversation, of course, but I do know as a member of the Fieldwork Council that we've had many conversations with multiple groups in the AOTA. And I don't know if Mr. Wilmarth would like to speak to this from his role in the AOTA, but letters have been drafted and sent to the Commission on Ethics in the AOTA, taking that angle in terms of who is really incentivized and incentivized toward what with receipt of payment for fieldwork education of students, who is really benefiting, who is losing, et cetera. And the Fieldwork Council, if I may speak, Lynette, you can back me up or not on this, but as a member of the Fieldwork Council, I can tell you that our general belief there is actually, I'm just going to back up and thank this board, because what you already passed regarding the Fieldwork Council's request to change continuing education, units for fieldwork education, et cetera, is something that was very valued by us in the Fieldwork Council. And as Otech president, I've actually trucked that around the state at many venues where I was asked to speak. And I've used it as an illustrative example of how an association and how a regulatory board work together for the greater good of all interested values and parties. And so I've actually been proselytizing a little bit, if I may use that word, that it was a perfect example of how we can all work together for the greater good, right? So, so gratitude I would like to express to all of you on that change as of recent passage in your board. But our work with the AOTA thus far, and again, I'm acknowledging that they're not able to speak to it, the direct parties themselves right now, but we've been told it's not an issue they're willing to hear in the Commission of Ethics at this time. And I can't say why they would have had that response. But again, I'm just trying to tell you that the Fieldwork Council has bypassed OTAC and gone to the AOTA largely with conversations to this point because the letter came out at a national level. So anyway, I don't know if it seems like the AOTA will speak.
I was also wondering if the professional associations have talked to the PT and speech associations about this, because it's obviously a common issue. This letter isn't specifically for OTs. It seems to be for all PTs and speech therapy interns as well.
Speaking on behalf of OTAC, we haven't had formal conversations with them on this topic specifically. However, I will share with you that CASHA, the state speech language pathology group, has reached out to me in very recent weeks explaining that they've designated a new position called the Liaison to Otech. I'm not sure what all the details of it are, but I was actually kind of very pleased to get that email and to receive the initiation from them of communication and collaboration. So that seems to be something emerging right now. So hopefully I'll have more information on those conversations in the future. It's a good question. Thank you for that question.
If I may comment also, there was an email string between the PT board and the speech board, which are both also in this building. So while I'm not sure if their board meetings were scheduled where they could raise this issue, the EOs did reach out. So I know that the PT and speech boards are also looking at this.
There you go.
Thank you.
So again, Chuck Wilmarth with AOTA, State Affairs Group. So I can only tell you what I know. I know this issue has come up. I am aware of the letter. I've read the letter, and I know that it's been discussed. But in terms of outreach between AOTA and Genesis and those discussions, I'm not aware of that. The board could send a letter to the president of AOTA and ask for additional information. But what I can tell you is that the board of directors met at its November meeting, and they reviewed many challenges facing the viability of existing fieldwork and other experiential components of educational programs. And the board voted to establish an ad hoc committee to explore current experiential requirements in the OT education and alternative models that would best ensure future entry-level practitioners are prepared to meet occupational needs of society. And so an ad hoc committee is being put together. That ad hoc committee is going to be meeting in February of 2017. The reason I know this is because I'm going to be a staff liaison to this group, and the board is going to be considering recommendations at their February meeting. And so, I think with this ad hoc committee, the charge is bigger than, fieldwork sites charging for opportunities. Let's look at the model we have now for clinical education, and let's look at other professions and see how it's done and see what those other possibilities are. And, the reason that I'm involved is because there could be licensure implications. There are other professions where clinical education happens after initial licensure. Our colleagues in speech have a model, and there are other professions that do as well. And so if we evolve the model, what would that look like? And so I can certainly report back as those discussions take place. But the bottom line is that we've got 30,000 students in the pipeline. We've got 180,000 practitioners out there, and there's a supply and demand issue in terms of the number of fieldwork sites. And Genesis is a business. They don't have to take fieldwork students. Nobody does. I mean, should they? Yes, it's important. But do they have to? No. And I think somebody had mentioned before, they've recognized that this is a business, this is a cost, and they are going to take these students, but they're going to be charging a fee. I think the letter also points out that there are additional costs, but they are seeking to recoup, a portion of those things. I think, and this is just Chuck speaking, but there are a lot of our fieldwork students get trained by the skilled nursing industry. And again, Chuck speaking, I think that's a problem because that's just one little piece of the OT practice world. And so, I think it is good for the profession to take a look at how clinical education is being provided and perhaps evolving the model, perhaps moving to a residency. I mean, again, Chuck speaking still, what are the possibilities that are out there? And then once we figure that out, what best trains our practitioners, how do we do that? Is it a change in licensure laws to create a temporary license? One of the things that I've also thought about is right now, if you graduate from an accredited school, you can take the exam fairly quickly. And so there isn't as much of a time where you're practicing on under supervision on a temporary license, and then you get your full license. That post taking exam period has been shrunk, and that's good, right? You can move on faster, but it's also not as good because there isn't as much time where you're out there for 6 months on a temporary license where you have a supervisor looking over your shoulder. So I guess the point with all this is that there is an ad hoc committee looking at the bigger issues related to the fieldwork model, and that this group is going to look at what other possibilities are out there. And that's what I can report in terms of the specific questions. The board could certainly send a letter to the ATA president asking those questions, reaching out to the speech and PT organizations to get their thoughts. But I think at the end of the day, Genesis and others can move in this direction. The ethical angle is interesting. I'm not sure where that would go. That's what I know.
Thank you.
Ada, did you have any comments?
Yes, I'd like to add, please. Again, Ada Boone Hurl, Sacramento City College Program Director, Occupational Therapy Assistant Program. Of course, there are certain things that have already been said that I won't repeat, that I would like to add a few comments about, but then I have a bigger picture perspective on Genesis and potential changes in education. Just as an add-on comment regarding the consumer, when we move into these kinds of models that some have to pay and others don't, as a public educator, my first concern is equity. And with equity for the student in terms of equity of opportunity, when those opportunities are narrowed, we can see loss of diversity. Loss of diversity in such a diverse state as California would potentially, from the view of a public educator, decrease diversity and therefore affecting the consumer who is from a broad base of diversity in this state. So that's a consumer comment. I'd like to follow up on a comment made previously about the student's perspective of, well, I paid, you should pass me. Another perspective, though, is the fieldwork educator themselves. Some of the most energetic training that we have to do as an educational program with our clinical educators is that it's okay to fail someone. We're by nature as occupational therapy practitioners driven by creating successes for people. That a lot of time the training and an extensive effort has to go into helping a clinical educator be at peace with that not everyone will succeed and that it is in the public's best interest to not have everyone succeed. So while the student might say, well, I paid, you should pass me, a concern I have is that the fieldwork educator would say, oh gosh, they paid all this money and they're almost there, so maybe I should pass them. So I just need to put that perspective out because a lot of energy goes in to telling people that it's okay to fail a student. There's a bigger picture story here, though, that I'd like to put out as my concern as a program director. Last year, St. Catherine's University out of Minnesota came into California as a new occupational therapy assistant program. I had no idea it was coming, although as a program director, I'm constantly looking at the ACOT website, looking at applicant and developing programs, trying to understand what the market is going to be, what are the demographics, where is the geographical distribution that was, for example, previously mentioned. Excuse me. Why did I have no idea it was coming? Well, Sacramento City College is the only accredited public OTA program between Portland, Salt Lake City, Vegas, and Southern California. So we serve a huge geographic area. But why did I not know? Because St. Catherine's is a university accredited in Minnesota. So it never shows up as as a developing program in California. So I had no idea it was coming. And all of a sudden one day I get this welcome, hello, we're here in Sacramento. And they're partnering with, and their didactic work, their whole classroom component will be online with monthly labs held at Genesis facilities in 2 different locations in Northern and Southern California. So there's a bigger picture story that I want to point out is how Genesis is I'm not trying to single them out as a business. They have right to do business as they choose. I'm simply looking at my concern as there being a leader in precedent of potential change in the overall educational model, which includes fieldwork education. So we have an out-of-state program, accredited out-of-state program coming into California, doing business in California. I did speak with Heather there was some exchange about a concern that can they operate in California but not be without oversight from the California board. And research reflected that I'm not an expert, I cannot speak, but that it was okay for them to do it because they fell within certain other regulatory guidelines. But we have, the Board of OT has no control over what they're doing because their accreditation is from out of state. So their entire educational program is online, and that's accepted from an accreditation perspective. Then students go monthly to a Genesis facility to do their labs and lab practicals and that sort of thing. And Genesis has acknowledged that they're going to need other fieldwork sites to meet the academic requirements of the program. So it's not that then it would go on into just Genesis, because also ACOT standards would require, as previously mentioned, the diversity in fieldwork education. So Genesis would not be able, for example, to provide an inpatient psychosocial experience necessarily. Presumptively, I speak. Maybe they have a locked dementia unit that would qualify, but I don't know. So I wanted to lay that out there today as stepping back and looking at the whole picture of how, as this model of precedent comes in, not just for the academic component, but the fieldwork component, there's a bigger picture to be mindful of and aware of, and done in a way where we lose, in the eyes of consumer protection, the ability to have influence. So that's what I would encourage the board to be aware of, is that there's a sense of having lost control. And on my perspective as a program director, and that I don't know who else is coming unless I go to ACOT's site and I go through every single state to see which developing programs potentially are developing programs for the state of California. Thank you for that opportunity.
You've brought up some very interesting comments, Ada, that I imagine, what might come before this board has to do with what happens when those programs come into California. I am interested, Heather, if you would probably speak on this a little bit. But when they come into California, and I mean, in all fairness and transparency, if it helps the public to know, I am a graduate of the College of St. Catherine, which is now the University of St. Catherine. In fact, I was the first Californian to go to school on scholarship to the University of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota, which thrilled my mother, who grew up in Ames, Iowa. That aside, I do want you to know that I had no idea like you. And I find myself to be one of, I love that university, and I find myself to be a very good and contributing alumnus who paid back her student loans before she was 30. I made that effort and commitment, and I say that to you because I think educational transactions are a commitment. I did not know they were coming into California either, and I happen to be the president of the board who's an alumni of that university. So in fairness, I say that to you not so much more to connect, but more importantly to say, how do we look at the state of California, those that are being educated, our public, how I know the wonderful standards, the high ethical standards of that university. I know how exceptional it is. But that aside, we also know that there are things that I'm curious to know. The students come here, they do the program online. Where do they go and get their supervision? Do they then go back to Minnesota and they fulfill fieldwork sites there? Are they in California? So there's so much that has to be outlined that I really actually, aside from all of those lead-in comments that I've just made to give you to set the background, I think more importantly, this is going to pop up for other license boards to really look at, and we really do probably want to think about how to take the lead on this, because I can really see this as a consumer protection issue. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, Heather.
So I have a couple of comments. One, that the board does not regulate the schools. It doesn't accredit the schools. It accepts students who have completed the OT and OTA programs from accredited schools. So that's the first comment. When Ada raised the issue, one of the things I did do was, knowing that we don't have oversight over the schools and there's really no way or no obligation for them to even, notify us, I did reach out for the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Education. And so they are the regulator of the schools that operate in California. So there were several emails, including one from an attorney for, I believe, the RN board, who had worked with the attorney for the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary, which I'll just say BPPE, please, because it's easier. But one of the problems is while BPPE would have oversight of the program if it had a physical location in California. The fact of the matter is that the laws and regs are older, and that basically the phrase they're using is that their oversight extends to brick and mortar schools. So when a school out of state is accredited and it's out of state and they are offering the programs online and the field work are being offered within our state, as written, BPPE has no jurisdiction, and this board doesn't. It's an ACOT matter because that's who has approved this out-of-state program.
Again, there's legislative work that can be done.
I was going to say, it looks like people have questions about whether the board can do this at some point. That would be a legislative change. Right now, the Boards Practice Act is very small, and it does not include this. Some other boards do have this authority, and so you could look at, other boards to see how they're doing it. But right now, CBOT doesn't have that, so it would need to be a legislative thing.
Which, if this authority, BP would,
BPP.
yeah, if they would have to take the lead before we would take the lead, realistically, correct?
I think it would definitely be of, it would be worthwhile to bring them into the conversation, and, because maybe they have some good input as to what this looks like and how these two areas intervene.
So I would just comment, I think it's actually two issues. One is the board wanting authority to approve the schools, which would obviously require legislation. The other one is to work with BPPE regarding their laws and regs, which only apply to the schools physically located in this state. So it's really two different policy matters.
The only question I would have is, since the lab work is required at a brick and mortar to complete the curriculum necessary for their certification, does that give us a bite at that apple because of that piece of it?
The field work is a part of the curriculum, and it is not, even though it happens here, it's their oversight still does not extend to them.
Did you ask ACOT why they didn't inform you? Did you ask the University of St. Catherine?
I have not yet composed anything to ACO. I was encouraged to let it be. I can't do that, and so I'm trying to balance multiple parties in a balanced
Right.
way. Could I say that?
I haven't had the chance to ask the University of St. Catherine either, so I hear you as well, but time will come. The time will come. Okay, any other comments?
I have a question, if I may. For example, when American Career College and CBD College were coming, does ACOT notify the other OTA programs in the state when a new program is in developing?
It's publicly published on their website because it's listed as a
Right.
California college. So you can look at
Applicant
developing and accredited and see who has submitted application for a new program within the state of California. But it's because it's accredited out of Minnesota, it
Right.
never shows up on the California
But
list.
they don't reach out
They
directly to.
don't reach
yeah.
out directly. It's self-initiated,
To
publicly
identify.
available
Sure.
information.
Well, it's more programs. For those of you who are involved in ACODE, I wonder if that's a suggestion you might ask of them, because potentially more programs could do this in other states. Which isn't a bad thing. There's no statement on good or bad. That's not where I'm going. It's just a matter of notification. You know, I gave you my long lead-in of my history because I was a little bit like, wow, for everything I did as an alumni, there's no notification. But, I can get over that. That's 5% of where my ego and head is at. So I'm over it already. As soon as we take a break, I'll be totally over it. But be that as it may, I'm trying to relate with you that there might be questions that you might ask that set that up for the future. Yes.
I just have one question. So, Western Career College used to have a program in Hayward, as I recall, a number of years ago, about 20 years ago, that went under. Would you have the same concerns if that was the location of this St. Catherine's program?
Do you mean it to be the geographic location? It's not, I certainly have no control over that. It's the transparency of knowing where the program's at and where are they going to be. It's because it ultimately leads to previous comments that the number one prevention of our ability to increase the size of our programs is because of difficulty in accessing field work. Which leads us back to the original point of the discussion, in that if they were to develop a program in Roseville, the time from applicant program to accreditation could be a 2-year window. That gives us the opportunity to build a relationship geographically that ultimately is for the greater good, as opposed to having no idea and trying to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah.
So it'll be what it is, and we'll deal with it. It's a matter of having the cards on the table, the facts known easily and publicly.
Thank you.
That's the point.
I have a follow-up question to that. So if St. Catherine's is partnering with Genesis, and that's their sole fieldwork placements, then for Sac City or Santa Ana or any of the other colleges that are placing within Genesis now, does that mean those are no longer available to you because your students would be bumped because Genesis has a partnership with St. Catherine's? Are you concerned about that? Is that occurring?
So clarification, the partnership between St. Catherine's and Genesis is providing the lab facilities to do within the curriculum prior to field work. Now, what percentage of field work placements Genesis is providing to those students, and how the priority ranking and that process, I don't know how that works. But I do know that because of the ACODE standards that requires us to train as generalists, we can't all place in skilled nursing. So we've got to provide alternate settings and populations to meet those standards, which I'm not familiar enough with Genesis. My perception is that they don't have that breadth of populations and settings that would enable them to stay completely within the system, their system. But it is concerning that if there is a priority ranking system, now the public institution is competing against the priority ranking of a St. Kate's student, along with the new upcoming requirement for payment of stipend to take the student, which will then eliminate that placement opportunity for the public institution.
Right, and it's still unknown if they're even charging the same fee, or if it's part of their partnership overall.
Well, St. Catherine's is pretty expensive, so they probably are.
I know.
What's another $1,000? That's probably.
So this has been a very enlightening discussion. I think I'm just, I'm more concerned about the lack of regulatory oversight, just in general, and considering that other boards may have similar issues with institutions coming in from out of state, but it seems they may have the ability to at least have some legislative oversight. I'm just wondering if that's an issue that we should at least table or consider or move forward with a change. Again, this is just the cusp of what's coming, I believe. So I'm just looking at next steps. What are we taking from this conversation and moving forward?
And just in terms of, thank you, Board Member Davies, I think just in terms of moving it to a tactical place, do you see that happening at a March board meeting? Do you see that at June? What sorts of information do you think you need before you in order for us to?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of moving pieces. So I think the earlier discussion about having a agenda item in regards to continuing education is probably one aspect, looking at the PDU aspect of how we can get more practitioners to be able to offer those field sites and field work and so on. I think that should be included in that overall conversation about continuing education. But I'm not sure if even at the March meeting we'll be prepared to have that with the ever-evolving conversations that are occurring. There's too many multiple pieces. Is it one component of a larger evolution of the entire structure? Are we looking at parts and pieces of it, just PDUs to increase field availability? I don't want this to be so large that we don't make any progress. For the same token, if it's too narrow, then we're not looking at the overall bigger picture. So I'm not sure if that warrants an ad hoc that's working in collaboration with the associations or what that looks like. So I'm kind of just open what the vision of the board is going forward. Because I do think it's an issue on the continuing education side. I think that's really where this lands, and it's already approved on the agenda item for the board.
Do you see it as a continuation of the work that we've already done on the PDUs, or do you see it as something new?
I think it's a continuing evolution of that. My only concern is I've heard a lot of conversation about increasing PDUs and offering that as an incentive for practitioners to increase the amount of field opportunities. But if we're doing that and organizations like Genesis and others are now adding fees, it's counterintuitive. As we lose more field availability, we're not even keeping up with the loss, let alone the gap that already exists. So I'm trying to figure out, it just seems to me that PDUs isn't the only option, but I don't think we've explored as a board what those other options could be. And I think, to Mr. Farrell's point, looking at an overall, how do we look at this? Maybe it's an apprenticeship, maybe it's an internship. What does that look like? I think that larger conversation needs to happen as well. So, in short, considering the agenda item on PDUs and continuing education is already set forth, then maybe that discussion is what we can do in the immediate future with an ongoing conversation through 2017 of what we'd like to accomplish.
So Heather, if you could just help us out a little bit here in terms of the continuity, because so the work that we've just done on the PDU and the increasing of the PDUs for supervising students.
Yes.
Okay. What would you see as the next step from moving an agenda item forward in March that this board, there are many moving parts. I agree with everything you said, board member. Is there something that could come before us in March that is of depth and breadth and meaningful, or?
Well, I just want to clarify, it was my understanding that the continuing competence issue that was going to be discussed at the March meeting was specific to eliminating the exemption for new grads at their first renewal.
Correct.
So that's fairly narrow. And then, but separately to incentivize, for lack of a better word, more placements due to limited availability, and especially in Southern California, the extreme saturation, is the board did move forward with increasing the PDUs earned, which I believe it's either going to be in effect April 1st or July 1st. And I'm sorry, I don't know that. It's up to the Office of Administrative Law. So I'll keep everyone posted on which date is the effective date. But that being said, the placement, I feel like, is a separate issue because of the saturation. And one of the things, and I'm sorry, Board Member Sharon Pavlovich isn't here today, because it's my understanding she is one of the people who does the marketing for Loma Linda and trying to find additional places for the placements for the students, because that's the challenge that the schools all have. which is also a separate issue from the policy matter regarding the regulatory oversight. So I feel like because of there's regulatory oversight, there's limited availability of current fieldwork sites and the predominance in the skilled nursing settings where there does need to be more diversity. I feel like those things need to be maybe parsed out and,
agree.
and are not a continuum of any of them. I think they're all solely separate issues.
I agree, and so I would ask you if I may just interject to keep this fluid. And so, do we have, when we look forward, and again having Board Member Pavlovich with us in March, do we have enough information to really look at and have a meaningful discussion on limited fieldwork sites, and do anything really around that? By then, I don't know if Mr. Wilmar will be coming back in March, but
Well,
because you have your ad hoc in February, there really was so you have your ad hoc in February, you would come, I'm looking at all the moving parts. We're trying to really look at the moving parts and see if there's anything really before us that we would do, or if this is a later, if we're still just in the wait and see mode.
it's a little hard because this policy takes effect September 1, 2017.
Right.
So it's hard to know, to take action before this takes effect, if it even takes effect, because who knows what might happen between now and September 1st, 2017, negotiation-wise behind the scenes. I mean, I don't know if, it seems like might be premature. I'm not sure what kind of role we would be able to have in a regulatory sense. And our PDU
I
regs
don't
haven't
think
even come
we're-
up, so.
Well, I broke down the items. I actually think we're on the same page. Board Member Bookwalter, I do think the regulatory piece is not something we're even there yet. But if you took the statements down that Heather Martin, our executive director, was speaking about, she talked about breaking them down into different parts. And so in terms of moving this agenda item forward, there could be some sort of dialogue on the limited fieldwork sites.
Yes, and I feel like I could reach out to the schools for them to provide feedback in terms of, like what steps are they taking, and what are their challenges, what are their shortages, these types of things, and having them share their firsthand knowledge, I think would be helpful to have the board have this information in a background document. For example, one of the comments earlier from Dr. Schultz-Krohn was that they admit 72 to 74 students a year and have 26 placements at Genesis. So that's like a third of them. For example, I feel like that's some of the data that needs to be collected. One of the things previously with the California OT Fieldwork Council, when I had conversations with folks, I think Diane Mayfield, Judy Palladino, I'm not sure who, but one of the things we talked about was that almost all of the locations where OTs and OTAs work are regulated by a corresponding state agency. So you have the Department of Aging, oversees adult day health care. You have the Department of Mental Health, Department of Developmental Services, which oversees the regional centers. You have the Department of Education, which oversees the schools. You have the Department of Health. So, there's about 8 state agencies that regulate those particular settings, most of which that, OTAs are employed. And for example, I feel like that's not something that's been tapped into. And whether or not it's this board's role, I'm not sure, because the board needs to decide from a consumer protection standpoint, if the students can't get their fieldwork, what's the impact to access to services. But if not, it might be something that the board can do some research on and share with the schools. I don't know what that looks like. I'm just kind of sharing some random comments, but maybe having an ad hoc committee meet about this in February to report back to the board in March. The board meeting's March 9th. That will be at San Jose State. I think there's enough time for that. And what we might be able to do is, I just quickly looked at the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. There are 11 healthcare categories that do currently have apprenticeships. Maybe we could get a little bit more information on that. And then also, we could provide some more solid background instead of just my anecdotal comments about, for example, when a school is accredited out of state but does have placement within California, what's the basis for that lack of regulatory oversight, and have something more concrete in writing for you to review. Then you could decide in March what you want to tackle and where do you want to go with that.
Well, I'm thinking that the limited fieldwork site issue is a national issue, and the AOTA conference is in April. And no doubt some discussion about it will happen then. And whether we meet before then or after then, I think maybe it would be interesting to know what, after that, after April, what might have, what ideas have come up, because rather, it's a larger issue involving other states. I'm thinking March is too soon.
I actually, if I may contribute to that, I would like to, from a fluid standpoint, and moving an agenda item forward because of the time in which this board meets and the practicality of having to notice things and the public weighing in, I almost would wonder if the board would be so moved to see March, what it would look like on the agenda would be more of an exploratory phase or a discovery phase, of which you would be welcome to do those surveys and gather that information, but that we would not put an ad hoc committee together until we have that information. We really hear from the AOTA conference and the people who are really on the front line, ACOT, about this issue, where they stand, and then really determine what our ad hoc committee would actually accomplish, which might even not be a formation till June. Of something like, we really don't know what we would do until the people who are on the front line would tell us what they're doing. Then we'll know what our takeaway is from a regulatory standpoint. I still think, though, to keep the issue moving forward, it would be very beneficial to have the exploratory work done that you've so identified, because you've really started that already, Heather, with the program directors, and I would like to see that continue so there's not a big drop in time, if everybody was in agreement.
Well, I'd also be curious to see what those other boards that are also impacted by this decision have, because I think there is strength in numbers. And whether that be an official position or just a statement, but I think that dialogue needs to occur, whether or not the decision's been made for this to take effect in September. I think maybe there's opportunity to maybe extend it, to have consideration, whatever it may be.
Well, my theory was, again, if Ileana can bring back on what we'd need to do legislatively, I wouldn't be looking for anything in 2017. The goal would be to, if it was something we so chose after doing our research and getting all the information, we wanted to try to move something in any way, would be for a 2018 legislative year. I think the thing that would be interesting, well, there's a couple things that are interesting. Genesis put a year, basically, notice. Maybe they're testing to see what the response to that would be. I think if we start to show action of which not only do they not be able to charge for it, they may be required to train more than they thought they would have to do, it could have a chilling effect on their decision to go forward on charging for those. So as we become more active in pursuing alternatives to address those concerns, which could result in them being regulated into providing a service that they thought they should be reimbursed for, it could change. The conversation could turn to a point is, rather than regulate this and charge for this, why don't we just continue to do what we're doing? I mean, it really could come to that point. So, I don't know.
Why don't you invite them to a meeting?
And that's why I was asking if anyone had approached or had discussions. Sometimes when these things are put out there, not all nuances are taken into consideration, and sometimes just an open dialogue and conversation of, this is the impact, this is what we see as the impact, these are the costs overall, how can we work together to figure that out? Maybe it's a limited amount of positions or scopes, or maybe it's a guaranteed amount of field work that's available to the state of California. I don't know what that looks like, but I think a conversation needs to happen, and I'm not sure if it's this board approaching them directly, just saying in response to your letter, or if it's this board along with other boards saying in response to your letter, this are the things that we'd like more clarification on because these are the impacts. But I wasn't sure if that was something we'd like to do sooner rather than later.
What do you think about?
I just like to go into a meeting armed with
Yes.
what our alternatives and responses
Agreed.
potentially could be. So that way, if they say, well, we have to do this because, we say, well, we may have to do this because.
Exactly.
Right? That's where I'd like to be.
And could we do that in March, maybe?
I mean, I think we can get the initial research for March, and then we
March or
can
June.
evaluate this, and then reach out to them following that, whether it be the department, we give our ED the first,
So we would do, March would be exploratory, we wouldn't be inviting them to the March meeting.
I think it would be premature unless, Heather's been really comfortable with what the other boards have done, and we're prepared. So I wouldn't make that a mandate, but I think,
It would be what would your thoughts be on that?
I guess it depends on the reason for inviting them would be to collect more information to help you formulate any action response, or if it's more dialogue related about the impacts. Because if it's the second one, I think having them come at March is too soon. I think you won't have the information. I just want to remind you with the new regulatory review process, the unfortunate thing is even if the board decided something, let's say by March, just for example, March of 2017, with the new process, this probably would not take effect until the beginning of 2019. The process has really changed in terms of this review period up front before the language is even noticed, which is a little bit different than in the past. We brought a concept, you guys said yes, go, or yes, notice it with these changes. And then the process started, and you saw it a lot sooner, and that's now changed a bit. So unfortunately, with the one-year notice, whatever action the board took, even if you pull the trigger on something today, this would be in effect long before any regulatory amendments would be in effect.
okay.
So and one of the comments, well, what's the impact to the consumers? What's the quality of the field work? You're not going to know that, I think, till after this has been in effect for quite some time. And then you're even that much further being reactive.
Right.
So I just caution, there's obviously a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts, but,
Is Genesis going to be at the AOTA conference? Oh, sure. Okay, so they'll be, for those of us who are practitioners, they'll be at our AOTA conference. I'm sure they'll be, let's let the people who are, from the practice standpoint, from the education standpoint, they would lead that charge, and we would wait and see. But perhaps then what I'm gathering from listening to this discussion is what we might look at in March would be some of the exploratory data that Heather would put together. Is that the read I'm getting from the board? Is that what you were suggesting and wanting, Board Member Davies?
Yeah, just add another discussion to the March agenda.
So, do you have that? You don't need this board to put any, we can bring it back when we add items if you need,
Yep.
and take it as part of that whole motion? Okay. All right. Any other public comments on this matter? Okay. It is 11:46. We're not taking a break yet for lunch. We are just taking a short break. We'll figure out the rest of the agenda. I want to figure out the timing on the rest of the agenda. When we come back from the break, I'll let you know when to expect, if there'll be a lunch break or will be, and how long we're going. I'll have a better idea of that. So if we could just take, it's 11:46, if we could take a 10-minute break, come back together, that would be great. Thank you. The current time is, welcome back, and thanks, everyone. I know we took a little bit longer of a time off, but here's where we're going for the rest of the afternoon and for our public audience. Our plan is to get through the rest of the agenda items, 7, 8, 9, up through 13, in the next 50 to 55 minutes, if not sooner. After that, we will go into closed session. When we go into closed session, we'll only be coming back to go into open session to say, hi, we're here. But for our public audience, you are certainly welcome to leave at that time, unless you want to be here when we open the mic up again and say hi and bye. No. But be that as it may, that gives you some idea of the work we plan to do and where we're going on our timeframes, and then we will be breaking for a lunch. Okay. So if we can move to agenda item number 7, review and vote on approval of October 27th, 2016 meeting. Do we have any questions regarding agenda item number 7? Want to say anything about that or no? Did you have a review? No. Okay. All right. Do we have a motion to accept?
Yeah, I move to accept the board meeting notice and agenda from October 27th.
I'll second it.
And if we could take a roll call?
I say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Do I abstain since I wasn't at that meeting?
Yes.
I abstain then?
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
Agenda item, what I'll do is I'll have us vote and approve on items 7, 8, and 9, and if there are any public comments on any of our minutes, I'll take them at the conclusion, okay? You want hold on. Are there any public comments on the October 27th meeting? Okay. Review and vote on the approval of the November 11th, 2016 meetings. That's agenda item number 8. Do we have any public comments on this item? Okay, we need a motion and a second.
I move that we accept the minutes as presented.
A second?
And if you could take roll?
I say yes. Jeff?
I have to abstain because I had to leave early, if you remember that day, right after we did openings.
That was on October 27th.
No, it wasn't, it was this one.
Oh, I wasn't there.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
I abstain.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
I abstain.
Oh,
Okay, hold on a minute. I don't have.
too many abstentions.
1, 2, 3. So, oh, that's because Sharon's not here today. So I'm still missing one. Ota, Teresa, Jeff. So,
That was the actual meeting.
so it must be Sharon and she's absent today. That's why you only have 3 ayes.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry.
Did we have to bring it back, or?
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, yeah, you're right. Was in attendance. Yeah.
Do we have to bring back a review and a vote, because we have,
I'm sorry, so
Okay.
let me step
Oh,
back
yeah,
to the
no,
last one. So it was the October, you had me still listed, but I had left.
No, it said that you left it.
I'm looking at the November 11th minutes, and Jeff, you're at the very end as well
Right,
as the company.
yeah,
So
that-
you were
that
there
was
for
the
the whole
one,
meeting, so you
yeah.
can vote on this.
you actually came in late to that
Right,
meeting.
Right.
You left early one, came in late,
See how I am?
but you're very effective in the time you're there, so we're good with it. Okay, so if we could just do that vote again, if we could just start the vote again, Jeff, knowing that you were there and you can vote? Okay, so if we could just take the roll one more time, Richard, if you don't mind.
Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Abstain.
Denise?
Yes,
Beata?
Abstain.
Richard, yes.
Thank you.
okay, so that one is, now if we could go to agenda item 9, review and vote on approval of November 17th, 2016 meetings. This was a teleconference board meeting. It was a closure of our sunset report.
I move that we accept the minutes for the Thursday, November 17th meeting minutes. I'll second.
I say yes. Jeff?
And I'll say, because I was there at the beginning and the end, yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa? Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Any public comments? Okay, one thing, just out of curiosity, because we are here at DCA, at some point, can you bring down a sunset review report? Just one, so that everybody can see?
Well, we got one.
Oh, you have one, okay.
Me too.
They're down there?
No, I mailed it to everyone, I didn't bring it with.
Oh, okay.
And here's,
That's okay, I can go.
and here's mine.
No, you don't have to. I didn't realize everybody had one. This is awesome. I just want you to know this is what made up 18 meetings this year. Was 18, right? Between
should've-
ad hocs, teleconference, yes.
We should have applauded your staff.
Say again?
So what's the cover price on that publication?
$100 cash.
We have to add it to skis?
No, $1,000 like Genesis.
Would you like one? Would you like one? Okay. I'll bring some down. Thank you.
All right, good work to the board. So now if we could go on to now if we could go down to item number 10, filing of addresses. Consideration and possible action related to proposed regulatory language to amend Title 16, Division 39, CCR, Section 4102, filing of addresses. Heather?
You have before you some proposed text. You can see section 4102, A, B, and C are all stricken. That is the board's current language. The underline represents proposed language. And although in our current 4102C, it identifies a laundry list of who this section applies to, after further discussion with Jeff Hansen, we did have a change that we would recommend to F. However, before we go in that direction, I think Ileana wants to share some concerns.
So if you, sorry. I don't have to shout. I have a microphone. So, I just have a couple of concerns. They're not major. They're something that the board should at least consider in terms of, I'm not sure that we have authority to do certain things. So, we need to, I don't know, we can try it. Basically, if you look at address of record, we ask for address of record and also the residence address. There is a Business and Professions Code, Section 136 that allows boards to ask for a mailing address, and those are the words that are used, mailing address. Well, that basically allows you to ask for one address. So if you're asking for an address of record and a residence address, as opposed to one and then the other one in the alternative, if you want to have a P.O. box that's public and something that's private, and you want the second one to be private, that's allowed. But in terms of requiring both, that is a little, I know other boards have done it because this is copied from PT board, so it's possible that this will be okay. Just the authority isn't entirely obvious. And then also with regard to requiring an email address, I know that that's under D, that PT board, because I know this is pretty much their reg. But it's modeled after, pardon me, I misspoke. It was modeled after in other boards. And I have spoken with other attorneys in my office who basically there's a split of opinion as to whether or not we can require an email address. So, because obviously a reg similar to this one did get through OAL, so they may be okay with it. But basically, this email address requirement isn't provided. It doesn't mean create an email address and give it to us. That's not what this reg is saying. What's basically it's saying is if you have an email address, we want you to give it to us. So we can't actually require someone to give them an email address, but you can consider it in terms of like an administrative thing that we can ask for. So that one also might be a little dicey. Everything else is fine. I don't have any major issues with this reg. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Another option in dealing with the email address issue is every time you ask for an email address, you can indicate in parentheses that it's optional, that they don't have to give it. So that's another way of addressing this without having to put it in the reg. But that's basically it. Heather had asked me about whether you need a mailing actual street address to serve a subpoena, and it turns out the post office does have some way of doing that. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more research into it, and we can go from there.
Well, the only thing is, we already had the reg that required giving a residence address.
Right, and it was in the alternative. It was
In section A.
right. Hang on.
In addition to the residence address.
Right. It says, in addition to the residence address, the person may provide the board with an alternate address of record. If the alternate address of record is the person's address of record, he or she may request in writing that the residence address not be disclosed to the public. That current section A doesn't actually require that the person provide an address in addition to the residence address.
Yes, it does.
It says the person may provide the board. So,
Can you look in the first sentence?
Yeah.
Shall provide an address.
oh, I'm looking at,
Oh, right here.
I'm looking, yeah.
Okay, but I'm sorry, the current language,
Yes.
4102A, requires a residence address. The address of record is offered as an alternative
Right.
to those who don't want
Right.
to get their, for example, their renewal at
Right.
their home, they want it to go to their place of business.
Right. So the way I read the new proposed language, and obviously tell me if you think I'm misreading it, but the way I'm looking at what makes the current section A and the new proposed section A and B is that you have to give a resident address in the current A. Okay, that's fine. And if you want to, you can give us another address if you don't want to use your residence address. That's fine because you have to give one and you may provide a second one. That's the second one that's kind of the not required one is not, you don't have to give an alternate address if you don't want to. Yeah, please.
Mike, I think what the intent of the old language isn't quite that. The purpose is the requirement of a residential address is what the board needs to have. And the problem with that is it could be FOIA'd if that's the only address we have. It's been FOIA'd in the past, so it becomes a privacy concern. So the board, in my reading of this, is providing an option, a level of privacy to a licensee that allows them to use another record as their address of record, but we still need to have their address of record, their home address, their residential address. So I think it's the only purpose for the second, and you're right, they don't have to give it, but if they don't give it, they don't have the right to not have it be a public record.
Yeah, and that's true for all boards.
Right.
I mean, even with the state bar, I have the same option. Their statute's a little different, but yeah. I don't put my home address as my public record because I don't want people to know where I live.
Right. You don't need them standing out front with a picket sign like somebody from my world.
So just in terms of understanding what's before, I have just a couple questions. I have just a couple of clarifying questions, if I may, and I'll ask them first, but they're Heather and Ileana. So what's before us today is to adopt this language or not. Is that correct?
Not to adopt it would be to consider it for approval, or even with suggested changes. It has not been noticed yet.
Okay.
So this is just kind of as the
okay.
first blush presentation.
And the language that's before us is exactly the language that is in the PT, California PT language, correct?
Which is why I think there's a possibility that this will get through.
With the exception of section F on the second page, that section F is copied after our existing section 4102C on page 1. And this is the one where if there's not an authority concern, then we were going to recommend that the language be changed from the positive to the negative and replace section F with, this section shall not apply to any person whose license has been revoked, surrendered, or canceled. And so then that way, if the board revokes somebody's license, if a licensee surrenders it, or they're canceled due to non-renewal, this section wouldn't apply, but it applies to everybody else.
And that's only relating to F, not E?
Only to F.
This section would not apply, okay. So, and that's language is found,
I just read it out loud. It's replaced this, section F duplicates what's existing language, but we're asking the board consider doing it in the alternative and identify the three, statuses, if you will, of a license that this section would not apply to. So, for example, if the board revokes someone's license for incompetence and they can't petition the board for reinstatement for 3 years, they won't be obligated to provide a current address. For example, you have no jurisdiction over them once their license is revoked.
okay.
If they're canceled due to non-renewal, that happens, you can expire and not renew for 5 years. If you don't, the license is canceled. If you come back in at 4 years and 11 months, then that's fine. You pay a lot of money and you get back on the track. But once that 5 years of non-renewal hits, it's canceled, and then those individuals also would not have to provide an address change.
And that language isn't before, I know you just stated it, but it's not written here before us today, because why?
Because section F was duplicated after the existing section 4102C, which is this one.
Uh-huh.
Rather than, for example, like retired's not on here. So instead of having a definition of who this applies to that could be changing in breadth or scope or description, instead simply identify the three license categories that wouldn't be responsible for providing address change: revoked, surrendered, or canceled licenses.
Okay, and so, Ileana, knowing that thank you for identifying some of the concerns, and in terms of really weighing out what some of those concerns are with what we know has gotten through the OAL already, and we know that this language likely would if it has already. I'm, again,
I
not
hope so.
living in that world, I'm making an assumption.
I think it's fair.
Okay, so did you ask the PT attorney how they got it through?
I did, and she really, basically, she agreed that, okay, so she and I have a difference of opinion as to whether there's authority. She thinks there is. I don't know that, I'm not convinced, basically. And my opinion on that is they got it through once. Another attorney thinks it's okay. Granted, I don't share that opinion, but it did go through already.
Okay.
So I do think it's worth a shot, but I do also want to put it out there that there is a possibility, however remote or not remote, because I really can't say, that they may say, you know what, no, you don't have authority for this. And I say it's worth a try. Another board has done it. I don't think it's terrible. So I say go for it. And
So were we going to change F or not change F?
my understanding is that Heather and Jeff were fine or wanted to change F. I'm okay with the change in F. She already ran it by me. I think there's no problem with it. So the only thing that we're working on right now is, I think, the authority question that Denise just asked, and I think that it's arguable one way or the other, so I say go forward. And then F is fine for me. From a legal perspective, there's no issues.
So if we agree in terms of moving forward, adding F, and we agree, let's just, for today's action purpose, agree that we have the authority. The next step before us is it gets noticed to the public, or it comes back to us in March, or is it both?
Sure.
There's a new procedure. It's not fun.
Who's going to share that
No, I was
procedure?
just making a comment on.
I thought you said, do you want me to? And I said, sure.
Oh, I was sorry. We
There's a
misunderstood
new
each other.
procedure, and it's
Okay,
not
so
fun.
basically, the procedure for doing regs now is slightly different. I think that there was a meeting with the executive officers and the maybe board presidents about this, but basically, the new procedure is this: that the entire reg packet needs to be approved by agency, the Agency of Housing, and I forget whoever's above Department of Consumer Affairs. We're in that agency. The whole reg packet needs to be approved by agency before it actually gets noticed to the public. So that takes a little bit longer up front. So it's hard to say whether this is actually going to take longer. It probably will. But basically, you're front loading everything. Once you notice the packet, hopefully it'll be pretty smooth sailing from there. It's just that you don't know how long that front part is going to take.
Define packet for me who doesn't live in this world. Define packet.
This might be helpful. I know I provided this in October, but it's been a bit ago. Under agenda item number 12, there's the standard 2-page report of where we're at with the different regs.
Right.
But right after that is a flow chart. And if all of this is unfamiliar or unclear to you, what I can say is previously, when the board approved language, then staff took steps to submit it to OAL and have it noticed. That is really the step that started the process. If you refer to this chart, what happens is when you agree on language that you want to be noticed, that's in box 2. So it's initial phase, Board and Bureau. Box 2 is where we would be at today. All of these steps until you get down to the bottom have to occur before the language is being noticed. And so that's the primary difference when Ileana's saying like all this review goes in at the front end rather than the back end. This review time in advance of the noticing all happens. A lot of, you can see a lot of folks touch it, and then the language is noticed. It's the minimum 45 days. We time it so that once it's submitted to OIL for noticing, we time it so that the end of the 45-day public comment period is a week or two before the board's meeting to give us time to pull together the public comment. And then that's when the next page starts. So the process is quite a bit longer.
So if there is public comment and you change the language, you have to go back to the
Yes.
beginning again then?
Not back to the beginning. It does require that 15-day notice that is currently in the current process, where you might see a shorter possibly time frame once the package is submitted. Like right now, it takes 6 to 8 months for us to get the package back before it can be submitted, and then OAL has 30 working days, which is 6 weeks, and then it's effective on a quarterly basis. So there's a lot more lead time up front, and I don't have any experience. I did ask the department's regulations coordinator what's been the experience with the review time of all these steps that are on the first page of the chart, and there was only one that was initiated under the new process, and then they pulled it back, so she really doesn't have anything to gauge this on.
Is this in response to North Carolina? We're adding additional oversight.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. But I just want to also let you know that between box number 2 and the end of the page, all of those things had to happen anyway. They were just happening at the same time of the notice period. So basically, the board would say, go for it. Heather would notice it for 45 days, and then it would continue to go through this same process. Now, instead of having that happen at the same time simultaneously with the notice, now it's happening up front. So I think the intention is that any issues with the reg language or anything can be can be identified early on in the process and make things go a little smoother. Hopefully that will be the case, and we'll see.
So in terms of, thank you each for that explanation. So in terms of understanding what's before us today, if we make a motion to accept, I'm just asking in terms of understanding the action, if we make a motion to accept the text as identified with the changes and the wording that you've identified, Heather, this means it comes back to us in March in that full format.
No, ma'am. It would probably be at the August meeting, possibly the November one.
And if we do nothing today, then we don't see it till when? Summer of 2018?
There's a new board.
February or March of 2018.
And it's just filing an address name change. Wording around filing an address name
Right,
change and
except-
emails.
Except the content of what the regulation is not what's problematic. It's just that this, this process has changed a bit. And I think we figured if we were able to get this through that approval process by April, the board could hear it in August, but all it takes is coming too late in April and suddenly it misses the August deadline in terms of coordinating the end of the public comment period with the board meeting so that the board could adopt it, and it pushes it out to November, for example.
Go ahead, Beata.
I have another comment on section C, the name change, because most of official name change applications, they require the reason and the proof. Are we safe with that? Just that anybody could just submit the old and the new name, whatever that might be? Or?
We have a form that does require documentation, two sources of documentation.
Okay.
So either, for example, marriage certificate or a divorce decree, adoption paper, I don't know if that would apply, but as well as an ID with the new name. So you can't just say, I'd like to have a
So
new.
it doesn't have to be stated in this regulation. It's obvious to everybody that would do the name change, right? That they will have to submit those documents?
We would not change the name without the form
Okay.
and the
Okay.
documentation.
I'd like to ask something really quickly, Heather. If there is a form for a name change, I think it's a good idea to incorporate it by reference in the reg.
Okay, then what are we gonna do about the online name changes?
How does that normally get handled? Okay, well, we'll talk about this offline because
I get
there's.
nervous about administrative functions being specific like that in the regulatory language.
Well, the thing is.
Because it's I understand, but
Yeah,
you
I get
can
it.
see how I would get.
I do. It's just that any time that there's a form being used that asks for information, we need to have authority to ask for it. And by putting it in the reg, that would give us that authority to request for those documents.
Correct. But like in the interest of I really am just intending in terms of how fast, if the threshold is met in terms of consumer protection, this is first where my thinking starts. And then we look at how fast technology is moving. Let's just pretend, and I'm truly not trying to be funny, I'm trying to talk about how fast technology moves. Let's just say that in future, not so far out there, you can use your thumbprint to identify, on your computer. And, well, you can already use it on your phone. My thumb opens up my phone. So, those sorts of things could be how your address could pop up. Do you see what I mean? And that's a very task-specific thing. So it doesn't matter to me how we get there. It matters that what's in the regulatory language
Isn't too limiting.
and protects the consumer.
Whoops. I agree. Sorry, I don't know how to use this button. So I'll say my response to this, I guess, is we also have to think about, as a state agency, our authority to ask for information of people and require them to give it. So if we're going to say, if you want to change your name, we want this form, we want this thing from the Department of Social Security Administration. Is that who does name changes? I don't know. But if you're going to require that someone provide you with some personal information, then you need to be able to say, this regulation provides me authority to ask for it. So, because the way the reg currently reads is, if you're changing your name, you need to let us know in writing. That doesn't require anyone to submit a form. It just requires, I can send an email, I can send a fax, I can come in, write it on a piece of paper, put my name on the thing, and give it to whoever at board staff. Right, to make that change. But if we're going to require them to use a form and require that they provide certain information, we need to be able to say what the need for us, because we're not in the business of maintaining people's information. We need it for specific reasons. And so we just need to be able to justify why we're asking for this and to have authority to do it. So I understand
knowing that the process has changed, I'm just coming at this from a different angle. I just want the board to consider this and think about it and weigh in. So knowing that the process has changed and it takes longer, and knowing that what's before us is language that has already been accepted, I draw that we know, so to me, that tells me the threshold of consumer safety is met. I would be so inclined to say, let's go forward. Where does everybody else stand?
I too would like to speak in favor of accepting this language with amendments that amended F, and also adding the reference to the various ways that one can change the name.
Does our public have any comment for us on this matter?
Can we have a read back on the F?
Can we have a read back on F?
We would recommend that F would read, "This section shall not apply to any person whose license has been revoked, surrendered, or canceled."
Richard, I know you identified that you were in agreement, but were you putting that in the form of a motion?
I had not yet. I was speaking in favor of the point. But I could make a motion. I'd like to make a motion that I'd move that we accept this language with the amendment to F. We approve the language as amended, as presented with the amendment in F, and with the addition of the reference, the forms, the name change. Documentation requirements. For the name change, both online and written.
We need a second. Second was from Teresa. Okay, if we could take roll, please. Laura, sorry. Second. No, I can't see you. Could you?
Sorry, Heather.
Did you get what you needed? Okay, could we take roll, please?
Jeff.
Aye.
Laura.
Yes.
Teresa. Denise.
Yes.
Beata.
Yes.
Richard. Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry, just before moving on.
Did you know why this is in here?
If that was an alternative. If I just may ask that there's a second motion about working with legal counsel to identify some language that would incorporate the online submission that was mentioned.
I have a question. If you in the title said filing of address and changes in name as accepted by the Department of Consumer Affairs, or in a form identified by the Department of Consumer Affairs, it gives us the ability to go to a thumbprint. It gives us the ability to go to a email. It goes to the ability to use a form, you know. It gives us, I don't know whether they would think it was overly broad in description, because then how would we know that the forms that we would accept it? But I would think we could provide that, some type of guidance.
DCA doesn't have doesn't have an official name change form. It's each board has their own process for doing it. So I get why you want to be a little bit more broad, so you don't require too much specificity in terms of, unfortunately, right now that's not an option because DCA doesn't have that standard across the board.
So just a point of clarification based on the question that Heather Martin just asked about the second motion. I guess we need to weigh in where we are on that. I didn't see that there's a second motion. I thought I heard a consensus that because the language, we were inclined, because the language had already gotten through, that we were accepting of this language with the addition of section F. If there's more that we need to deliberate on, I thought that's what the motion was.
I
That
also added, including a reference to the name change forms, online and printed.
Okay, and so what is it you need, can you identify your request, because I'm,
Right,
yeah.
so while I can easily add the form reference, the online piece would really require me to work with Ileana to come up with some wording, because Breeze is built to accept name changes.
Right.
And the online submission, data requested with using radio buttons and data boxes mirrors what's on the form itself, but it is a different way of submission, and it's not called a form. So.
Well,
that
hang on, I gotta make sure I understand this. Was that a comment and a concern, Ileana, that you brought up?
The comment that I had made was whenever you have a form where you're requesting information as part of a reg, like a name change. Hi, please submit this form when you're doing your name change. that form, whatever it's called, it needs to be incorporated by reference into the reg. Well, Heather pointed out that you can also do a name change online through Breeze, which is the licensee information kind of portal. So basically, in my opinion, as long as the form that OT uses and the information being requested as, on the computer through Breeze, as long as information being requested is the same, then Heather and I can easily work out some language to add to C to describe what that form looks like. And that's what Heather, I think, is asking in her request for a second motion, is for she and I to work on it so that this can be added and you guys don't have to look at it again.
Because right now, the addition of the form, it would identify the form name, the revision, form number, revision date, and it would say, comma, hereby incorporated by reference, but that change alone doesn't add in the online piece. And that's the piece where I was asking, could we?
And I guess what I'm trying to understand, I'm not trying to deliberate too long on this, but now I'm starting to get a little bit concerned, or, why? What does it matter? We already agreed that the language works. Doesn't that make us too narrow? I'm going back to the previous argument. And I guess I'm looking for other board members to explain that if you don't hear it that way, if there's a consensus with the board, I don't have to raise this at all.
I think it sounds just more like a language of consistency, that if and when we refer to an existing reference document, whatever, we want to have consistent wording of that.
Correct, but beyond that, I don't want that to be the only way we can take a name change.
Got it.
So when we say you need to fill out this form name, I don't want to be limited to that because the system will take it also.
And it's your, okay, so then what would satisfy me is it's your belief by having that in there as a second motion, it really doesn't change the context of the proposed text anyhow that has been approved.
It doesn't change the context insofar as there would be some wordsmithing that would expand the way the name change could be submitted to more than just this form that would be added.
And will that expansion cause us issues in getting it through?
No, I don't think so, but if
Okay.
it's a matter of just wordsmithing it with Ileana, what's what the accepted
Okay.
term is being used throughout DCA, and it will be slightly different than what you approved today.
I'd like to make a move, I move to charge the executive officer and legal counsel to consult on language to include online forms as well as approved paper forms.
For addressing
For
name
address-
changes.
name changes, yeah.
Thank you.
I can't vote on that until you give me one other clarification
Okay.
so,
I can.
well, you can all vote.
It
I
doesn't
want
have to be
to,
unanimous.
well, I'm actually asking a clarifying question so I can vote properly. I just want to make sure that whatever it is you're asking from us is not changing what we opened up with this discussion in terms of this language getting through.
No,
Okay, that's all I need.
nope.
Okay, feel free, thank you.
It's okay, no, it's fine. Is it time to vote? I say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. Moving on to agenda item 11, consideration and possible action related to proposed regulatory language to add Title 16, Division 39, CCR Section 4149.5, petitions for reinstatement of modification of penalty.
So under agenda item 11, you have the notice which sets forth the reasons for the changes, the initial statement of reasons which further gives the specific purpose and rationale for proposed changes. I left out the original text because there was a modified text which that is included as the third item. And then, of course, the two forms that would be utilized for the board to either consider a petition for reinstatement of a license, or when a probationer wanted to petition for early termination or modification of the terms, they are two separate forms, and then both forms are incorporated by reference into the text. So the task before you today is, if you don't have any changes to the modified text or the forms, then board staff would be looking for an adoption today.
Again, with the incorporated by reference.
Yep.
It's there.
A
Yes.
and B.
That's what that looks like.
Yes.
If anyone's curious.
So is it safe to assume this form cannot be submitted online?
Did you hear that question?
No idea.
I don't think so. I'm not sure. Jeff?
What's that? No. We could work on doing it.
Wait, petition for reinstatement can be submitted, but,
It's paper right now.
okay, so the transaction side's on the VO side only, not,
Yes.
or VR
On
side?
VR side.
VR side only, okay, so yes, so this is the only way this information could be submitted.
I'd like to speak in favor of adopting the language as presented.
I second. Do we have any public comment on this matter?
So should we do a motion?
Do we have any other,
sorry.
oh, I thought that was a motion.
I thought so too.
No, I was speaking in favor.
Oh, okay.
It's Robert's Rules of Order kind of stuff.
I was seconding in favor of that thought. So, do we have any other board members that have any input on this? Heather, anything more to say? Ileana? Okay, so we do need a motion.
All right, then I'll move that we accept the language as presented. Adopt the language. I move that we adopt the language as presented.
Seconds by Laura. Feel free.
I say yes. Jeff?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Teresa?
Yes.
Denise?
Yes.
Beata?
Yes.
Sold.
That's been before us a long time, where we've
Yeah.
had discussions on it, so nice work. Thank you. Okay, moving on to agenda item number 12. Update and take action, if necessary, on pending rulemaking files, California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Division 39, Section 4130 fees, Section 4161, 4162, and 4163 relating to continuing competence, Section 4172 to standards of practice for telehealth, and Section 4176 notice to consumer.
Just as a reminder to the board and for the members of the public, the reason the item 12 is noticed with such detail, all of these packages, the board has already taken action on, but they are listed very specifically so that if after the meeting is noticed and then either one of the control agencies or the Office of Administrative Law had a concern, we've adequately noticed it and the board could take action on that. So that's just for a point of clarification. That's why it's worded that way on the agenda, but then in the packet, under the actual report, it's really just a status update. And what happens is, once it leaves our office, we don't know who or what agency might have comments or need additional action by the board. So you can see from the report where the various pending rulemaking files are at the different processes. The amended application went into effect in October. Standards of practice for telehealth just recently was returned from DCA and dropped off at OAL's. That'll be updated in the March report. The fees and continuing competence packages have been submitted. Again, we're in this control agency approval process. The notice to consumer will be the one that will be going forward next.
And
then
we just
today-
voted.
You just voted on this one today.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So at our last meeting, you were talking about the telehealth regulation that was under DCA review, and you weren't sure if it was going to get in or if we're going to have to start over.
Yep, it just recently came back and we submitted it to OAL.
So we're
So we
within.
got him.
We're still under the wire.
We're under the wire.
Great.
So, but I mean, it's at OAL, and if they had concerns, then we have the opportunity to bring that back. But it's highly unlikely that it will be disproved, and it hasn't stalled out. That's for sure.
Great. Thank you for getting that through the DCA review, because I know it was difficult for you guys.
Yes, it was. Okay, so that's page one. On page two, on the back page here, probation monitoring costs, filing of addresses. I'm sorry, I recognize that last time that was listed as number 3 and we moved it up, but it was only because with this new approval process, I knew it took some time, and in order to start capturing that information, I'm sorry, I took the liberty of moving it up, and not only that, it's a much more simpler process than establishing the probation monitoring costs, which is the one the board staff will be working on next. Any questions?
No, but I hope that when the board looks at this, they look at the amount of things that we have. It's no easy feat, and we've done a lot of good work together for the consumer and the profession, so that's good.
I have a question. In our earlier discussion regarding consideration for potential changes for oversight of institutions and so on, would that then be added to this list? Or is it considered?
It's
I
on.
think it's not yet
Not yet there.
for,
Right, got it.
So now we are moving on. This is an update, and there is no action that needs to be taken on section 12, correct? That's an
correct, it's
update.
an update only.
Okay. And do we have any comments from the public on section 12? Okay. Moving on to section 13, executive officers report.
I was looking for the rulemaking calendar, which I usually have in here, so I was gonna give you some sample dates, but it looks like so basically, today in the audience, there are 2 new staff members that have recently joined us, and we are looking to have 4 additional positions start in January. Part of the salary savings for the vacancies will be used for construction or tenant improvements in our existing space to convert an existing file room and remove a wall and add some carpet and build in a couple of cubicles. So that's where the vacancies have resulted in savings that could be redirected. Included in the handout also shows the,
What does that bring staff total to?
I don't know, it will be 15 when all positions are filled. Wow. This is quarter 1. Sorry, copy and paste, I neglected this, quarter 1. So, basically you can see that, we did collect more revenue than money was spent in the first quarter. The detail is behind this and shows breakdown by line item, the, various revenue categories, as well as the, various expenditures. And, I don't know if the board has any questions. One of the reasons our expenditures have been slightly less is due to limited resources. At the beginning of the fiscal year, staff were working on the annual report and also the sunset report, and that included involvement by several enforcement staff. And so they are just now able to kind of switch gears from supporting board and committee meetings and working on the annual and sunset reports, and now resume their enforcement activities. So the reason the expenditures are less than the actual revenue is really due in large part to our underspent enforcement money.
What is
Any
what is miscellaneous services to the public?
That, I believe, is sales of documents. So, for example, let's say a CE provider company is expanding and they want all OTs and, San Francisco, Marin, and Alameda counties, for example, then they actually buy that from the Department of Consumer Affairs. And that's one of the reasons that folks are given an option to provide an alternate address. So again, their information is not, their home address isn't going out to people who purchase that. That happens all the time. They can buy it, you know, by labels, or they can buy a CD.
And this is,
Okay, and so this is, so Denise is referring on the revenue on page 14 in the middle of the page under delinquent fees, and in the column it says $17,000. At the beginning of the fiscal year, we have to, that planned receipts column is, we have to provide to the department what our projected revenue is by categories specific. And so in this case, we predict that, based on a $75 delinquent fee, that the board will earn $17,000 from late renewers.
but gratefully to show, because we have not met that and it's only 7,000, it means we have far less late renewers. Is the upshot of that?
No, because this is only 1 quarter in, and we're already half of what we projected for the entire year. So, for example, if this.
Oh, with the year starting,
So, yeah,
got
July
it,
1.
got
So,
it.
yeah, so
So that's
3
why you
months.
did quarter one. This is quarter one, got it.
Correct.
Got
So
it.
if we straight line this, which is, this is 1 quarter worth of data times it, then, I mean, in theory, we're looking at 4 times 7 or 28,000, meaning that we actually underestimated this revenue category.
So, you know, circuitously working back towards our profession, when we, Heather Kitchen, when we agreed to sort of lock arms and figure out where there are monies that are available, perhaps helping us on the professional side with the outreach to tell people not to renew late would keep this fee down and would therefore make more dollars available for their membership. You understand? So that we could possibly recover some dollars there for you, thereby, you know, I would prefer that we had no delinquent fees, if you frankly want to know the truth. That means there's a consumer issue. So just, I know that's our message to carry, but that's one way for us to be forewarned and forearmed to really help members to understand. You know, it would be just like me going to Starbucks every day and not realizing it until I'm, you know, $3,000 in debt in my coffee fund and
You're
not.
gonna have that $12 coffee
Not
soon.
realizing, well, actually, that would be Phil's. Okay, so now that I've upgraded to Phil's, you see where I'm going? So I think it's just a matter of us working together to educate, and it looks like there's found money there that could be better utilized in a professional side if people were aware. Why give us 75 when they can give it to you? Yeah.
So presumably, if that other regulation goes through where you have everyone's email address, you'll be using emails to communicate to them about renewal deadlines and that kind of thing, and reminders. I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious, but,
I'm so sorry, no, I'm sorry that, the system as written is not currently set up to do that. They're still at a paper, printing, postage, charging, send out the envelope, because some folks will renew online. Many folks still send their checks through the envelope enclosed, which goes to the Department of Consumer Affairs Centralized Cashiering Unit, and then there are those who still send a check directly to the office. We can't, at this point, require that only online payments are, or only online payments for renewals are accepted.
oh, I guess what I was just, was bringing up was that you'll have their email address. Can you send them a notice and say, you're set to expire, or you already expired? And, you know, I mean, obviously you have to do the formal notice through the mail, but to what extent will these new email addresses help get folks in line
For reminders.
for reminders?
To what extent will Breeze help us to further our outreach efforts, I think?
You know, I think that's a question to answer in a couple of years. And I only say that because the reg hasn't gone through requiring it. I mean, somebody had asked about if I shared something with you, for example, this was related to the survey by Dr. Brigger-Stanton regarding the use of modalities in the California schools, and had asked, I said, I don't even know that we have that many email addresses. And I went through a month of renewals, and out of 912 renewals, all of which was a combination of online, DCA, and board processed, and there were only two email addresses by people who did it online and submitted it. Now, hundreds of people did renew online, but only two actually submitted their email address to us. So even though the system is driven by use of an email, that's not the same thing as them giving it to us. And so I really think that's an outreach issue, and also it would, it's my understanding it would also require a computer configuration change too. So that's why I said I can't estimate that, it's just a little too early. But I wouldn't presume that reminder would have come by email at this point. Any other questions?
Okay. Do you have anything else in your report?
Yeah, just lastly, there's one other item. It's actually related to the budget. It has to do with the fact that when the board was discussing the sunset report and the committee's recommendation to require a jurisprudence exam, then the sunset committee wanted to recommend that an attestation was a part of the renewal process, that either the applicants upon licensure or licensees upon renewal basically self-certified or attested to the fact that, yes, I have read the OT Code of Ethics and I'm familiar with it. And it was at that point when folks from the Department of Consumer Affairs reached out and said, there's this little Hoover Commission report that came out a few months ago, and any changes to the licensing requirements really need to be legally defensible. So in order to meet that threshold, we could do an occupational analysis and an audit of the national exam in order to determine what, if anything, would be appropriate for this ethical standards renewal attestation. So the Office of Professional Examination Services has provided this overview of what would be entailed for reviewing the national exam. And more importantly, following it is a schedule, because one of the things you all were considering, well, what would that look like and when would it take place and how would that relate to the sunset review process? And so the occupational analysis, if the board did choose to go forward, with the understanding that the project event months specified, could be 1 to 2 months off, but that, for example, if it started in March of next year, then it would wrap up at the end of 2018. So it's about a 15-month process, March of 2017 until November of 2018. So here's a sample schedule, and part of that to determine also for the board is the cost of what that occupational analysis would be. So they have a breakdown by the different portions of the review, and if you get to the back of page 2, you're looking at $50,000. So that would be with a little bit of the expenditure in the current fiscal year, which the board could absorb, except that the largest portion of this funding of this occupational analysis would occur in 2017-18 fiscal year. The $40,000 is not absorbable. And so I bring this to your attention. You need to, decide what your options are, because the budget has already been, the deadline to change the budget has come and gone. There is what's called a spring finance letter that would allow the board to, if they wanted to look into this, request the funding in January. If it makes it through the various control agencies, which also not only include the agency over the Department of Consumer, it's the Department of Consumer Affairs, the agency, and also the Department of Finance, to see if that augmentation would occur in the July 17-18 budget. And we would not know probably until April, after April 1. And so in terms of coordinating this, and I'm sorry if this is overwhelming, but it's kind of important to your decision-making, the sunset report was submitted December 1st. The hearings will probably be in February, possibly March, but the policy committee hearings, when the bill carrying the board's sunset extension and/or any of the ledge proposals you have submitted will actually not be heard until late March or April, which is, the timing is off from the spring finance letter. They are separate hearings. They would kind of cross yet run concurrently, and there is no interdependence except knowing about the money is what's important to you all to decide if you'd like to go that route.
So the impetus for this particular change, I know it came out of Sunset Review. I remember the discussion, and it was to add the ethical attestation to the application. In terms of doing that, we decided, are we required to have an occupational analysis done in order to do that?
It's strongly recommended.
Right, but then it costs us $50,000, right?
And that was the only purpose that was the whole reason we're looking at this, is just to add that ethical.
Correct, as
AOTA, Code of
consistent
Ethics,
with
or
the
whatever it is.
sunset report's recommendations.
So are there other things we were looking for in an occupational analysis that would make that make sense?
I don't think so. I think originally the attestation was considered as a easier and more cost-effective use of board funds rather than developing a state-specific exam to address ethical violations within the state. And then it was through this process, then it was advised that the board should have an occupational analysis, and so I'm presenting, this information to you. We didn't have this before when the board was thinking about this.
So if we did add the statement and did not do an occupational analysis, what would that look like? How would we be viewed by the department? I mean, are we getting the basement office? What's happening? In the best way that you can answer, we're looking for some guidance on this.
I'm not going to say that it's a requirement. However, I think if you were to be cautious, you would consider an occupational analysis before requiring this. I think the important distinction about the occupational analysis, it would include the national license exam audit, because the board's looking to establish an attestation that the ethical standards have been read in response to ethical violations. And I think part of the occupational analysis will be to determine whether or not the national exam adequately covers that.
If it doesn't, what would we be looking to do to add that to our own?
Yeah, why?
Well, I don't know. I mean, for a few more bucks, I think you guys could have a state exam, to be honest. I mean, it's a lot of money to add another question to the renewal form. I mean, if I want to just go down to the most basic part, I mean, that's.
Right.
I think what you're saying, and I'm saying, yes, I understand and agree. And I feel like the ethical standard attestation was looked at as a less costly way, other than, the very expensive prospect of developing and establishing and requiring a state exam.
And I also think, having been a part of that discussion, when Laura Haith was our chairperson for that, I really think that the consumer protection was taken into consideration, and this was a good, reasonable outcome of what we could require that was cost-effective. So then to go forth with it, and to be charged $50,000 for it, those two things don't add up in my mind either. And that's why I then went back to, if there's other ways for us to get to the same outcome without adding something to the application, then certainly let's look there. If we are feeling so bold and feel like we have enough evidence as a board, then let's just vote to do it without an occupational analysis. I'm not suggesting that, I'm just saying to us what is before us. Or we can do nothing. Do you see any other options?
So are there, sorry.
Is there another alternative?
I think that you could look at regulatory amendments to require the attestation without this.
But that's
We
a
ha-
lengthy process.
Well, not only that, it runs the risk that in the event the study was conducted, there would be evidence that applicants would not be able to meet that criteria. I mean, we run that risk.
The other thing to consider when you do regulations, there is a necessity requirement, so you have to justify why the regulation or why the regulatory amendment is necessary to do what you're proposing. So I'm not suggesting that you guys do what you need to do in terms of the analysis, but I'm just saying it would help the regulatory process if you had one.
But wouldn't data regarding complaints and citations also?
I'm not saying you couldn't do it without it. I'm just saying it would just bolster the necessity, meeting the necessity requirement.
Chuck,
So I think there was a related conversation, I wasn't here for it, but wasn't there a discussion about changing the professional development requirements and having some portion be related to ethics in occupational therapy? I mean, certainly something that is done in a number of states where periodically, every couple of years, you have to have a course or a seminar or something in ethics. And is that possibly on the table? It seems to me, I mean, I could read the Code of Ethics and then I could attest that I read it, but I think the application of the Code of Ethics through continuing education, I think, is where you might get some change. And this occupational analysis or development of a separate exam, I don't know, that seems like a lot of work. So I guess my question is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Is this idea of some sort of continuing education requirement, is that another option? Maybe looking at what other states have adopted is an idea. And I think that's about it. Well, I guess the other piece of it is, we certainly do have some ethical dilemmas within the occupational therapy profession, and in particular, some areas of the industry. And I think that there's a need. And if the regulatory boards engage on this, I think that would be good. We've seen situations in certain industries where there have been huge legal settlements. And, the feds have taken action from that perspective, but we haven't seen much from the state regulatory boards. So just to conclude, I just wonder if this idea of continuing education is a possible alternative.
that's a good point. Do you want to comment?
Well, I just think that, asking people to attest to having read the Code of Ethics is it's a perfectly good idea, but not at $50,000. I just don't see the upside. We have regulations in place that affect behavior and what is ethical, what is appropriate behavior and inappropriate behavior according to the regs, and that's, I think that is probably adequate.
So if we now choose to do nothing and the sunset review's been submitted, what happens there? Are we going to be asked about?
Yes. Yes, that is highly likely, because that was one of the board's recommendations, or that was one of the board's responses to a question on the follow-up, what have you done since the 2012 sunset report in regards to this?
But we'd be able to justify it. We'd be able to take from the minutes of this meeting and justify, and the $50,000 cost and the new information. You feel comfortable with that?
And we have an established national examination that we've been used, the NBCOT examination.
Just for clarity, the state exam would not replace the national exam. It would be in addition to.
Yeah.
Bless you.
So you're saying it could be redundant, but it would be cheaper?
Well, no, I mean, the occupational analysis, I mean, the cost, it is what it is. Whether you use it to justify an attestation that I promise I read the ethical standards of practice, versus you're using it to begin the establishing a jurisprudence exam, which would be specific to California. I mean, I can tell you from an anecdotal standpoint, people do not know the laws and regs. They know their employer's policies and procedures. They know what their workplace requirements are. They are not familiar with the laws and regs.
True.
They're not. I mean, it's unfortunate, but this falls, of all the things they need to know, this kind of falls down there. I'm perplexed by it, but I mean, the fact of the matter is that's what's the case.
They don't read their Practice Act.
No, they don't. And I feel like the attestation, you're not going to still get 100% compliance, but quite a few people don't even know what code section it is and have never read it, when they have to say under the penalty of perjury, I promise I did, they're going to take pause, and a majority of them will read it.
But
Now, whether or
isn't-
not they follow it, I don't know, but I mean, I think it was to increase the likelihood of fewer ethical violations.
But I thought the attestation was that they read the Code of Ethics, not that they read the regulations.
Well, the code of ethics is in the regulations.
It's in the it's
Yeah, but
our code of ethics.
They could just read the Code of Ethics.
Okay, I'm not talking about the AOTA code of ethics. I'm talking about the ethical standards of
But
practice.
they're still not going to read the whole regulation. They don't have.
What? It's
They're
like
not
13
attesting to reading
lines.
the rest of the regulation.
Well, I don't have a response for that, because it means 13, occupational therapy practitioner shall do the following, shall avoid the I mean, it's like, it's
Okay.
13 things. I mean,
So you
if they
feel
don't.
strongly that it's worth $50,000?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying people should know it. They should read it. They should be familiar with it. And I feel like if they were maybe more familiar with it, there might be fewer complaints, or of the complaints there are, maybe fewer would be not related to ethical violations, possibly, and possibly not. But I mean, I don't think it could hurt, since there seems to be such a large portion of the population are not familiar with them in the first place.
I have to confess that I have not read the Apple Terms of Service, but I've checked that box.
Well, then you know what? If you violate and you hack that phone and you violate, they're going to come after you and they're going to say,
be no longer
Richard,
on
in
this board."
2016, you said you agreed to the terms. And so that's sort of that's this hammer. And that's why I say, if it's under penalty of perjury, a lot of people just check boxes. But when they see that I attest under the penalty of perjury, most people don't keep flying through it. Some will, but I just hope it gives them pause. They're like, wow, wait, ethical standards of practice. I better go look. Oh, I never saw that before, or oh, it's longer than it used to be, or something. Just nothing is
But
not
if they violate an ethical standard of practice and they are caught doing so and they're brought before this board, there's still those standards still apply to them, regardless of
do
whether they
still
check
apply.
the box.
I'd rather take $50,000 and put it towards videos that go on our website that answer some really imperative questions than add a statement to an application. I mean, I actually do teach a class to doctoral students on advocacy ethics and legal implications, and one of our assignments is they have to go to their state license board, and they have to look up the act, and they have to talk about a cause they weren't familiar with, and they have to relate it to their own practice. And I think those kind of outreach efforts, whether we join forces with our program instructors or we look for outreach opportunities, those are a better use of our ability to influence and educate to get to the outcome we need than spending money to put a statement on an application that half of the people might breeze through it and half of them might stop and pause. That's what I would think.
Okay, so I have a suggestion then. Because the issue of the eliminating the continuing education requirement for first-time renewers is on the March agenda, What about if part of that is expanded to include information? I mean, there are a number of other boards that do require 2 or 3 hours of ethics of their total hours. So what if I bring back data regarding other California healthcare boards and some of the other states' OT boards to kind of give you an idea about that? How about a little bit more information?
I would find that helpful. Where's everybody else weighing in on? Teresa, Laura, what do you think? Jeff?
Absolutely.
Beata?
Sounds good.
I think you have consensus. For 50,000, I'll build a clinical lab and I'll do all the field work in the state of
Buy you a
California.
van. You could travel.
There you go with my mobile.
Mobile ethical standards coming your way.
No, I meant fieldwork sites, get it?
No, I go.
I was weaving in agenda item, okay. All right, did you have any more?
No, that was it. I just wanted to raise the occupational analysis, the fiscal impact and the fact that that's not absorbable and give you the background to make the decision, what you wanted to do about that.
That's really helpful, as well as your conclusion about what to come back in March. That'll be great. Okay, so are there any comments from our public? Okay, seeing that there's no other items left for the open session, we are going to go ahead and adjourn into closed session on Thursday, December 8th, 2016 at 1:26 p.m. Thank you very much for your participation and attendance. Tomorrow's meeting, Friday, December 9th, starts actually earlier at 9 a.m., and it'll be right here in this room. Thanks.
Are you taking a break now, or are you going into closed session now?
I have to find out, we're taking a 2-minute break so I can talk to Board Member Davies over there. Ready. Okay, we are reconvening from closed session. It is currently 4:54 on Thursday, December 8th for the California Board of Occupational Therapy. Seeing that we have no other items, we do need a motion to adjourn.
I motion that we adjourn.
Are we all in favor? Aye. All right. We are closed for December 8th, and we will see you tomorrow in this room, 9 a.m., for the continuation of the board meeting. Thank you.